David Lichtenstein, and welcome to Rachel Mila. And this week we're going to be speaking about something that's in the headline: measles, MMR, vaccination, and particularly vaccinations in Halacha. Is there a halachic obligation to vaccinate? What's the source of the obligation? A parent who refuses to vaccinate, can we vaccinate their children against their will? Can a shul or a school have a right not to allow unvaccinated children in as pupils, students, or members? A non-vaccinated person who causes harm to children, etc., does he have to pay for their medical bills? So we have some really fascinating and current discussion, and we are going to have an amazing group of guests. We have the number one anti-vaccine advocate in the world. He helped produce a movie about it. He appeared in a movie, Dr. Brian Hooker. He appeared in the movie called Vaxxed. From London, England, we will have the great speaker, famous Rav, Dr. Rabbi Akiva Tatz. He actually wrote a book about medicine, including vaccinations. He personally appeared in front of Rabbi Yashiv Zechron Levracha and asked him these questions. From Lakewood, New Jersey, we'll have Rabbi Yitzchok Gottesman, a parent who doesn't vaccinate. He's anti-vaccine. We will have the physician, the famous physician from Lakewood, a Rav and a doctor, a Musmach, Dr. Nochum Indich. From New York City, we will have an attorney, Joey Aaron, who's representing a yeshiva or a number of schools who have refused entry to unvaccinated children. Let's hear from him how the courts are responding. Before we go to this week's program, we had so many mails and calls about last week's program. We had, played a clip from a Rabbi Aderet and a Rabbi Brog. Bottom line is, Rabbi Aderet said he wasn't sorry that they were killed. I thought it was very surprised at that position. He also said it was because they were gay. And by the way, just for the record, I'd want to clear that up. That it's just like we actually quoted from the Mishnah Halachas. He said there's a big chaymer on being moitzi lazan kedoshim. So here's something interesting. Rabbi Jeffrey Myers, who's the spiritual leader of the Tree of Life Synagogue, stated unequivocally that the report was untrue. There was no bris taking place in our synagogue. So wasn't not a bris, not for gays, and not for gays. There was no bris. It was Pashat Baba Maisa, Mitchilat Seif, it was Taka Alaz. But I was surprised at the amount of people who actually agreed. They said they weren't sorry. Here's a Reb Tuvia Applebaum. Listen to what he said. He said he made a kiddush when he heard they were killed.
I wanted to make a kiddush all over the Shabbos, so the kiddush that happened and 11 people died. Baruch Hashem showed his hand. We're waiting to see Hashem's hand in our midst. 11 people were killed for the terrible tragedy that they did. There's no kiddush whatsoever. Their kedushim, I don't know. But we have to know we saw the other Hashem. Killed Shabbos and then in my alley to the nth degree, and no question in there. We were able to witness the other Hashem. That's my take on the situation. Many other serious people aren't, especially in the Messiah, we can use the term if you have me on you. Otherwise, I'll come call you a master. Very good, and maybe you'll follow them. Okay.
I was very hurt. I was deeply pained at the sinner that a number of our callers had towards Frei Eden. And besides the obvious question is, I would ask Reb Tuvia, do you make a kiddush every year to celebrate the 3 million Freya Kedoshim who were killed in the Holocaust? I mean, do you make a kiddush for that? I know that, there are certain factions in Germany that make a kiddush for that. I was very surprised to hear that a Jew would. But also besides the Hargasha, it's the Mishnah and Sanhedrin and Daf Mem Vav. We spoke about how these people were Tinnik Shenishbik, according to the Chazanish, according to Reb Moshe, according to the Roiv HaPoiskim, and the last generation held these are Tinnik Shenishbik. But more than that, the Mishnah and Sanhedrin and Daf Mem Vav says when it talks about the Nigmar Hadin, the Haruge Bezdin, so the Mishnah says on Member of Ketzad Toilunai, say, how did they hang people? But Rameya says at the end of this Mishnah, how do you do the mechanics of the killing? Rameya says, Amar Rameya, Bishasha Adam Mitztayer, when a person, this Rasha is Mitztayer b'misasai, Shechina Mai Meres, what does the Shechina say? Kaviyachal, what does the Shechina say? The Shechina Hagdosha, Shechina says, Kalni Miroshi, Kalni Mizrai, my head hurts me, my arm hurts me, I'm in pain. The Shechina is in pain. And the Mishnah says, Im Hamokai Mitztayer al Daman Shel Rishoim, if the Shechina is in so much pain over the Daman Shel Rishoim Shenishbach, Kal V'chayma al Daman Shel Tzadikim, so the Shechina is crying, even if it's not a Tinnik Shenishbach, even on the Russia who a Nigmar Adin gets Misa, how do people say they're not sorry? How do people say that they're making a Kiddush? It's honestly, it's Mavel al Arayan. Let's go to our main story this week. Our main program is about vaccinations. So let me give you a little bit of history. In 1998, vaccines were given for many years, for decades. It eradicated smallpox, mostly eradicated polio, and many other diseases. You know, mumps, rubella, etc. were measles were not eradicated, but declined tremendously. And in 1998, a doctor by the name of Andrew Wakefield, of all things a gastroenterologist, a stomach doctor, issued a report in a very prestigious medical journal in England called Lancet, in which he said that there was a direct correlation between vaccination and autism, and it created a panic. Many people stopped vaccinating, and a serious journal. But then in 2004, 6 years later, a journalist in the Sunday Times called Brian Deere reported serious ethical violations of the 1998 papers, author Dr. Wakefield, and it said he had found out that he had been paid by a law firm that was suing vaccine manufacturers. Could you imagine? So he was doing it for the money. Well, guess what? The Britain's General Medical Council investigated. They found it to be true, and they revoked the license of Wakefield. Dr. Wakefield became Eis Kapelitschmacher because he had created basically a false paper. The Lancet afterwards retracted the paper, and all the co-authors, almost all the co-authors, retracted, and they said they were fooled, it was a fraud, etc. Here is a quote from the editor of the British Medical Journal. He says, "We have a very different picture of a deliberate attempt to create an impression by falsifying data." Basically, the whole thing was a baba mice. It was a thing. By the way, the movie Vax, which created so much, concern. Who was the producer? The same Andrew Wakefield. Not only he was Chayzer al-Kiyah, not only was he accused and convicted of fraud, he lost his license, he actually went ahead subsequently to produce a movie. What happens? So now this fellow, Dr. Brian Hooker, what we're going to have on, he actually wrote a paper, another paper in a medical journal, following Dr. Wakefield and saying the exact same thing. Now, what happened in the interim? Post Wakefield was debunked. There have been, and I'm getting a lot of this information, you could print it out from the Washington Post, Wikipedia, but it's been published in many areas. There have been 38 different journals have investigated this, including the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of Pediatric Infectious Disease. New England Journal of Medicine is, by the way, the most prestigious journal in the United States. The Journal of Autism, right? They have all published papers, and none have found a link. And you will hear, by the way, Dr. Hooker admit that there is not a single journal in the world, a single scientific body that will go on paper to say that there is a link today between autism, except for him, between autism. He says there are a number of doctors. We will talk about all of them or most of them, but there's not a single journal or scientific body that today, post-Wakefield, found that. The Journal of American Medicine, JAMA, in 2015 did a study on analysis of 96,000 children. The journal concluded that there is no harmful association between the MMR vaccine and the autism spectrum disorder. Right? Very interesting. Now, who are we going to have on? And we're going to put this online. We'll put on the JAMA report, etc., but you can get it all on the Internet. We have Dr. Hooker, Brian Hooker, whose story is in Vaxxed. And in the story, in Vaxxed, he says, my son was born, he names the year, and he says, you see him in this movie saying, what does the cow say? And it, boo moo. And what does a bird say? Tweet, tweet. And he says, 2 weeks after his 15-month vaccines, and there's music here, he lost all language. He lost eye contact. You could pick him up, and he would just hang limp. This is what he says in the movie. That's really dramatic. Actually brought tears to my eyes. But what did he do? Here's the problem with Dr. Hooker. He went ahead and he sued, right? And what did the court's decision say? Which, if you actually read the court's decision, the court calls him a liar. And what does the court say? The court says your own doctor, your family doctor has, at 7 months, your child wasn't responding. At 9 months, we said he's developmentally delayed. There's something very wrong with him. At 12 months, numerous times before 15 months, he got his autism. He got his vaccination at 15 months. It was conclusive that this child was not a well child. So in the movie, what he's saying, at 15 months it occurred, the court actually calls him a liar. And I believe I tried to do this with an open mind. I tried to approach this. Who else shows up in this movie, or in Dr. Hooker's papers? A Dr. Mark Geyer, G-E-I-E-R. You can find this online too. Dr. Mark Geyer is frequently cited by proponents of that vaccines cause autism. He testified in many cases, but you could go to Wikipedia, where it just states the facts. His credibility has been questioned by 10 different judges. In 2003, a judge ruled that he presented himself as an expert witness in areas that he has no training, no expertise, and no experience. He's not an expert witness. In another one of the 10 cases, the judge said his testimony was intellectually dishonest, not reliable, wholly unqualified. Another judge wrote he may be clever, but he's not credible. Another judge flat out called him a liar. So I'm sitting here and I'm saying, we have over 36 journals have investigated this. There's not a single body that has come out and been able to find it. And the three proponents, one of whom who actually made a movie, which a few of these fellows appear on, all have been discredited by numerous judges in different continents, different countries, and being called liars. So it's interesting. We have later on in the program, I'm cheating, I'm skipping ahead because I interviewed. We have a very ernst person from Lakewood, and he says it's all a conspiracy theory. All the judges are conspiring against the kids. Congress is conspiring against the kids. All 36 medical journals are conspiring against the kids. Why? Because they've all been bought off by the pharmaceutical industry. Now, I'm not a big believer in conspiracy theories. I mean, there are so many of them. But you'll hear Rabbi Tatz later on really have a tremendous pirch on this. He says, that's absurd, he says. The pharmaceutical industry makes its money selling drugs, medicines. He says a vaccine costs a few pennies, and the kid's protected for life. A kid who gets measles, 25% of them, 1 in 4, end up in the hospital. They can end up with encephalitis, hearing damage for life, many other, a whole peckle of diseases. What does it say? They could permanent hearing loss they can end up with. They can end up with swelling of the lungs, severe ammonia. 1 out of 500 or 1,000 die. and a whole host of other diseases. He says if they were looking to sell drugs, they would not sell vaccines. You don't sell the prevention, right? Isn't that they say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure? They would much prefer to sell the pound of cure. So if anything, the pharmaceutical companies should be coming out anti-vaccination. Well, we're going to have all these people on. It's a very lively back and forth. I push back on everybody. So I'd love to hear your opinions. Listen to these physicians, both the vaxxers and the anti-vaxxers, for yourself. Let's go to our program. We have on the phone with us Rabbi Sruli, who's the director of New Jersey and Pennsylvania Division of Chai Lifeline. Welcome, Reb Sruli.
How are you, Reb David?
So, Reb Sruli, you, as I know, I've seen you a number of times at CHOP. You deal with these situations. Have you ever had the unfortunate circumstance of sitting in the room, in a hospital room, with a child who was unvaccinated and therefore came down with one of the diseases that can come from being unvaccinated?
Reb David, first of all, I cannot thank you enough for bringing this to the forefront and giving it the time that you're giving this topic, because there's nothing that I'm more passionate about. After 18 years of working at Chai Lifeline and sadly seeing hundreds and hundreds of some of the most horrific cancers and diseases and genetic diseases, there's nothing I feel more passionate about than this, because when you're dealing sadly with a kid that's diagnosed with cancer, or a kid that chas v'shalom ended up in an accident and has a spinal cord injury, HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world, and you feel like you can't, you feel helpless, and you try to help them during the most difficult of times. But to be in a room and watching a mother with a little child that just a week ago was running around and the cutest little kid in the world, and seeing that kid die from whooping cough in front of a mother's eyes, and a mother is holding that kid, and there's nothing to be done. And you think to yourself and say that this mother followed the pediatrician's directions, did get the shots, but the baby is young, and infants are the most susceptible to whooping cough, but it's people around them that came in contact with this kid and did not get their shots, and their kids did not get their shots. And we know how whooping cough, also known as pertussis, how contagious it can be. And to sit and watch a mother cry as she's saying goodbye to her youngest child, when there was something to be able to be done about it. This
is an unvaccinated child?
No, the child did get, but what happens with pertussis, with whooping cough, is that you can't give an infant everything right away. It's with stages, and they're the most susceptible, so others around them didn't, and therefore they caused the baby to die. If only the people around this baby, in playgroups or in shul or in other areas where this baby went to, if those people would have gotten over their selfishness of their issues with getting vaccinated, that baby could have been around.
You're saying this kid was killed by others who were unvaccinated?
Absolutely correct. Killed.
So when somebody does not vaccinate their child and the child gets whooping cough, it becomes a killer and will kill other children who are below the age of being able to be vaccinated.
Correct. And there are certain kids and there are certen infants at time that can't even get the vaccine. The point being is...
You're turning your child into a potential killer. That's what you're saying.
I was in the room. Reb David, twice. Not I didn't hear this from others. I was there. I cried with the parents, and I saw kids dying because others didn't vaccinate. I saw it myself with my own eyes. Kids that died from whooping cough. I can't give out more details, obviously, but over my years, I've seen it myself. So this is not a question of side effects. This is not a question of two sides to an issue. This is a question of life and death. And your decisions that you decided not to vaccinate put other people at risk.
So what do you feel about schools, or what do you feel about people who think that schools do not have the right to expel children who are unvaccinated?
I don't I'm not a gadol, and I don't have opinions about these matters. I know one.
Can I ask you a question? I don't understand.
I know one thing. Let me finish my
If you saw somebody running across the street in middle of the
exactly
street,
do
you need a gadol? Do you need a gadol to tell you get out of the street because you're going to get hit by a car? Like, have we put our brains in little boxes that we can't say that somebody's at risk of death, and unless I get a bracha from a gadol, I'm going to say run across the street? Like, what have we become? Where does this say anywhere?
This is a question of ritzicha and roitzvim. Kids are dying, and those are the facts. There's no two sides to the issue, and somehow or another, I'm missing something here. But Chazal, who address everything, already addressed this by saying if someone needs to eat on Yom Kippur, and it's the hardest isser in the world to eat on Yom Kippur, and there's two doctors that differ. If he's in a sakana, you go to the majority opinion of Rav Reifim. There are no two sides to the issue.
Tough ratio chesed cotton gimel in the Machaba, if anybody's looking for it. Yeah.
Rav Reifim. There is nothing else. And the Sharetzian, I think, says there, Rav David, the Sharetzian says that you have to go by the Rav Reifim in the society you live in. Don't quote me doctrines from Cambodia.
He brings from Rabbeinu Menayach.
Right, South Africa or other places, right? There is no question. There are no two sides to the issue. Every single case, Chazal tell you. You want to know what the answer is?
Did this happen to you on more than one occasion? You've buried a child that had contracted a disease from somebody who was unvaccinated?
Two, I was in the room, and one I'm very aware of, and I was not there. I would rather not mention the third disease, which it was, because that may be revealing. But I've seen 3 kids die. Yes.
It's fun. Rabbi Fried, thank you very much for sharing your time.
And thank you so much for bringing the issue to the forefront.
We have the honor of having with us from England, London, England, Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz, who is one of the most famous speakers in the Jewish world. He is originally South African. He's a medical doctor. He went to medical school in South Africa. He then did his internship at Washington University in St. Louis, one of the greatest medical schools in the country. He was a military doctor in South Africa. He wrote a book, Dangerous Disease and Dangerous Therapy in Jewish Medical Ethics. He's also a very big, famous Talmud Chacham and speaker. He was a Talmud Muvik of Hagayin Tzaddik, Rav Moshe Shapiro, somebody who I considered certainly one of my Rebbeim. I don't know if he considered me a Talmud, but I considered him a Rebbe. So it's a great honor to have you with us, Rabbi Tatz.
And thank you very much, Rabbi Christine. I'm honored to be on your program. So,
as you know, in America right now, there is, as well as Israel, there is an outbreak of measles due to lack of vaccination, as many parents believe that there's something dangerous about vaccinating. And there's been 7 or 8 cases now in Lakewood, and there was 50 or so in Muncie, in Williamsburg. It's all over, and it's the biggest outbreak practically in the United States in the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, it's one of the top 3 or 4 largest outbreaks, and it's interestingly, significantly by the Orthodox, by the Fruma. So, as somebody who's both an expert in both halacha as well as medicine, let me start with like a softball. Is there a halachic obligation to vaccinate?
Yes, there is actually an obligation, and I'll tell you on what it's based. The basis of the obligation is one is obliged to do what is normal. So just to give you a bit of a feel for this, here's a story that should illustrate this very clearly. When I was in practice in Israel, we had a family in our community who refused immunization. They were into holistic naturopathic medicine. They refused to vaccinate their children. The 2 doctors in the practice, myself and my partner, we were very anxious to immunize the children for their safety. And I entered a discussion with the father explaining to him why I wanted to do this. So he said to me, what are the risks of the immunization? And at that time, the problem was the debate centered between us on the question of whooping cough vaccine. The reason I tell you this is because the whooping cough vaccine at that time had a risk. The vaccine itself had a risk of 1 in 20 to 40,000 children dying or having serious neurological disease. So I told the father, it's true there's a risk. And he said to me, well, why do you want to give my child an immunization that has a risk? I said, because we do the math. The risk of your child getting a complication from the vaccine is 1 in 40,000, but the risk of getting whooping cough and dying from it is far greater because 2 to 3% or even 4% of kids under 1 year old when they get whooping cough die. So society makes a decision that it's a trade-off that's worthwhile. There's a significant risk of dying from the disease and a very small risk of the immunization, and that's why we do it. As I was telling them, so I realized that I was lying completely. My information that I was giving him was completely inaccurate. The accurate information is that if I give his child immunization, he indeed has a 1 in 40,000 risk of serious harm, and if I do not give him the immunization, his child has 0 risk of getting disease. And the reason is because all the other children are immunized. When all the community is immunized, there will not be an outbreak of the disease. As you know, this is a community effort. It's not an individual thing. You need 97 to 98% of a community immunized, and then you will break any transmission. There will be no epidemic, and therefore even a few unimmunized children will not get it either. That's an interesting question. He wants his child to ride on the risk that everyone else is taking. His child is safe because everyone else is taking the risk. That's a serious ethical question. So we decided to ask Rabbi Elyashiv. And the parents were very amenable to that. And I'll never forget the experience. Late one night, I went into Rabbi Elyashiv with my partner, the other doctor, and the Rav of our community, and we put the question to him. Rabbi Elyashiv said it's absolutely required. He even said to me, you may force them with a psak, clear psak, to immunize their children. As I left the room, I turned to Rabbi Elyashiv and I said, surely the Rav has said that because it's not fair. It's just not fair. Rav Asher Weiss, in fact, has made this point very clearly. It's not fair for one child to escape the risks of the vaccine and ride on the immunity of the community. Rabbi Elyashiv turned to me and he said to me, no, that's not the reason. He said the reason is because one is obliged to do what's normal. This is a concept of dashba rabbim, when the majority throng through a certain area. If it becomes widespread enough, it becomes a norm. If it becomes a norm, it becomes an obligation. Rabbi Elyashiv said to me, you're a doctor. You know that even in the furthest reaches of the third world, little kids are immunized. It's a total international standard. Once it becomes an obligation, once it becomes a standard, it becomes an obligation.
And I'm curious, Rabbi, what did he base that on? What halachic precedent, or tshuva, or rajba, or Yerushalmi, what did he base that on?
He said nothing at all to me in that conversation about a background, but if you look it up, you'll find, Rabbi Asher Weiss is clear about this, in my book you'll find references to this. Once a thing becomes widespread, it defines a standard. For example, the care with which a doctor is required to take care of his patients is the minimal standard, is the standard that is used across the board by consensus of experts. But once a thing becomes, if a thing is not known to be harmful, for example, it's permitted. One may drive in a car, not because it's safe enough, but because it's a normal thing to do. This is a very broad halachic area. Rabbi Silberstein says the same thing. And I'll give you another example. I was in Lakewood some time ago, and someone told me that Reb Chaim Kanievsky says that immunizations is nonsense. Shtuyot. So I sent my friend, who's a close colleague of mine.
When you say shtuyot, what do you mean? I apologize.
I
saw the letter. This was a letter given out by the Lakewood Yeshiva, and here it says, recently in the letter addressed to, if this is what you're referring to, addressed to our guide, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, Reb Chaim paskin that schools cannot refuse such children.
Let me tell you what happened in this incident, perhaps it'll make it clear. Since the word was going around in Lakewood that Reb Chaim is not in favor of immunizations, I was not in Israel at the time. I asked my colleague, who's an ophthalmic surgeon who takes care of Reb Chaim's family and his grandchildren, to go and ask him his view about immunization. And he said, it's a clear obligation. All my children and grandchildren are immunized. And then my friend, I don't want to mention his name on your program, just in case perhaps a wiser not to, but he said to him, and what should we do with parents who do not immunize their children? Reb Chaim said to him with a twinkle in his eye, give them a good frask, a good smack. That's what parents deserve who do not immunize their children today.
So the letter is just dishonest? Like, what does that mean?
I'm sorry, but I haven't seen the letter. I'm just telling you an incident that occurred 2 months ago when, in response to a challenge about not immunizing children, we asked Reb Chaim. It was completely clear that I did not ask him about excluding children from schools. I did not ask that question. I asked only the question of whether it's an obligation to immunize children. And in the modern context, he said it's clearly an obligation. Rav Asher Weiss makes the same point very clearly. I was zeichet to be in Rav Silberstein's shir for doctors for many years. I still receive the written version. And he's very clear that this is an obligation. I'm not commenting on excluding children from schools. I think that's a softer issue. And I'm not posek. I would not like to comment on that. As you know, there are different opinions about how far we can go in excluding children. Let me make a prediction for you. I'm not a Navi, but I think it's very clear. What happens when people stop immunizing children, as soon as you get enough vulnerable children, you get an epidemic. And I'll tell you two things that will happen. Unfortunately, children will die, and the ones who die are the ones with cancer. The kids who are not able to mount an immune response and whom you may not immunize, the immunization is too dangerous for them, so they're vulnerable in the community. They're almost always safe because everyone else is immunized. You only need 98%, so we can tolerate 2% of children who are not immunized. But as soon as that rate falls below 90, you get down to 91, 90%, you get an epidemic, and it's the vulnerable children who die. So it's the kids with cancer, it's the kids who could not be immunized. Unfortunately, you probably heard that a child in Jerusalem died this week of measles.
And why was that? Why did the child die, do you know?
The report simply stated that it was an unimmunized child. It did not report on the child's immune status in terms of whether he had a disease or something. But of course, you know there's a significant incidence of kids with measles who get meningitis, which leaves them permanently scarred neurologically, and some of them die. And the second thing, I'll venture a prediction, if I may, is that within time, kids with autism are going to come forward who never were immunized. As soon as we get enough people in the community not immunizing their children, and the incidence of autism remains, of course, as it always was, because it's not connected to immunization, kids will be coming forward with immunization, with autism. The parents will report the kids were not immunized, and within time, people will realize that there's no connection. Unfortunately, that will take time, and the pendulum will then swing back. So, it's very hard to convince people who are fixated on not immunizing kids, and I think our focus should be on the people who are not informed and ask for an opinion. Those who are very firm about their anti-immunization basis, one very seldom makes progress changing their minds.
So let me ask you something. In your opinion, Rabbi Tatz, does a school or a shul have a right not to allow a non-vaccinated child in?
David, do you mind if I complete the previous point? Can I do that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes,
I think that's important. Yes. I was saying that I think two things are bound to happen, and I'm not claiming to be a Navi, obviously, but unfortunately we've seen this pattern before. The first thing that happens is, as you said, as I pointed out, it's the susceptible, vulnerable children who unfortunately die first. And the second thing that happens is that the things that the anti-immunization people are claiming happen, for example, autism as a result of the vaccine, what will happen inevitably is that more and more parents will come forward admitting that they did not immunize their child and the child got autism anyway. The reason this is the case is that autism is not connected to vaccination. There's a baseline incidence of autism anyway. And as soon as enough people, and most people unfortunately are coming forward and saying, my child was immunized last week, they developed autism this week. Proof that the immunization causes the autism. They fail to realize that every child coming forward with autism was vaccinated the week before because all the kids are immunized. And therefore they make a spurious connection between the two. The resolution of that issue is, as time goes forward, and a greater and greater percentage of children are no longer immunized and still get the same rate of autism, that will grudgingly be acknowledged. When that information spreads, we'll see the pendulum begin to swing back in the opposite direction. That's the point. Let me add another point you might find interesting as well, in similar vein. Many people come forward and they say, one claim is that we think this causes autism. Another claim they say is that many more children today get polio, for example, from the vaccine than they do from the disease. And that's quite true, of course. In fact, the situation in the United States today is that every single case of paralytic polio actually is due to the vaccine. Now, that sounds shocking and terrible, but give it a moment's thought and you'll realize the reason that's happening is because there's no more natural polio at all because the vaccine has been so effective. And so the only kids that come forward with the disease now are the ones that get it from the vaccine. In fact, this is such a clear picture at the moment that the recommendations, in fact, if you look in the New England Journal of Medicine last month, there's an editorial pointing out that we are now stopping to give the live polio vaccine because it's much more dangerous than the disease. We've killed the disease. There'll be no cases of polio in the United States for a long time, and therefore we can cut back now on the live vaccine and give the slightly less effective killed vaccine because that will be enough to keep the disease at bay. And of course, the hope with polio is that we can eliminate it completely. We're on the verge of doing that. Smallpox was completely eliminated about 30 years ago, and so doctors younger than me have never seen a case. The reason is that the vaccine was so effective, and it's of course it's a disease that hosted only in the human, and so we've eliminated it. If all countries cooperate correctly, we'll be able to eliminate polio completely. And if I may make a third point, and then I'll give you a chance to speak, though. The third point is this, is that many parents, many young parents nowadays, are against immunization because they think that it causes harm, and they've never seen the harm of the disease. Many young parents, they've never seen a child die or get meningitis from measles because they've never seen it.
Have you, doctor? Have you seen a child with meningitis from measles?
Absolutely, and once you see a child die so unnecessarily like that, or as I have seen children who grow up mentally tremendously retarded because of a meningitis, or you see a child die of chickenpox, right?
Doctor, have you seen this from a child who the parents refused to vaccinate?
My experience, again, is with kids who had cancer. My experience in South Africa with kids who are not immunized because of a social problem, because of the apartheid era, and very often, almost always, it was kids who are malnourished, starving, the ones who have no immune resistance anyway. That's the kind of child that dies in an outbreak, even in a community where people are immunized. But again, the point I'm trying to make is this, that young parents nowadays have never seen a child die of measles, for example, or whooping cough. They've never seen a child get pharyngitis, from diphtheria. These are diseases been eliminated by the vaccine. So the people think, well, these are not serious diseases. We've never seen a child die from it. They don't realize that the international effort to vaccinate children has almost eliminated these diseases. And unfortunately, almost inevitably, the pendulum will swing when they start seeing these diseases again, and the horror of that will be so immense that people will begin to pick up the immunization again. Unfortunately, it's a pendulum that swings backwards and forwards.
So a few questions. First of all, so a parent, you say, clearly has an obligation of ushmartem es nafshesechem. Now, somebody sends a child.
Sorry,
who may
David,
have...
I did not quote that source. That's not the source, Rabbi you've quoted.
Okay. I apologize. The source you said is because it's the natural thing to do, and Dosh Rabin, and everybody's accepted it.
That's right. You may do things that are normal, and you're also obliged, on the other hand, to do things that are normal. Screening, for example. When prostate screening or mammography or colon screening, once it becomes widespread enough, it becomes a halachic obligation. It's a debatable point about when it's widespread enough, but once it becomes... But
there is no source that you've mentioned to the concept that something becomes widespread, it becomes an obligation.
The way they usually put that, the poskim, is a dashboard. I'm telling you what Rabbi Yasher says to me.
I just can't think of a halachic source. I apologize. I thought, where you have an example of that, like, if making weddings a certain way, does that become like? Can you think of? I'm at loss.
Absolutely. We're talking about danger. We're not talking about social norms or tznius or modesty.
Okay.
Absolutely not. We're talking here about what a danger. Doing a normal activity, one may fly on scheduled airlines, one's allowed to drive cars, you can eat food that has colorings and additives, even though they've never clearly been shown to be safe, because Hashem runs the world in the way that is normal for human beings.
Okay. I mean, the closest thing that I could find to a halachic comparison is, for example, is you see in the poskim they discussed whether somebody's allowed to go to sea, and this is talking about 1,000 years ago in the era of the Pinto, the Santa Maria, etc. Even though the great dangers, and one of the reasons they said is because the derech is to go to sea, and therefore we have no right to aser it. But to make it an obligation, I just can't. Okay, but let me continue. Go ahead. I apologize.
Let me make this point: is that when it's sea voyages, which you find Chuvas in Yehuda and many other Makarios, there we're talking about things that are not normally accepted, if I may say so. These are slightly above the normal risk, and the heter there is because the Gemara says Ela funeses nafshay. In other words, when a person is doing something, the Gemara. Correct. So when a person is doing a thing with professional justification, that's accepted. Amateur basis, not. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a famous tshuva on American football. In that, I'm sure you know that, in which he writes that a person playing football professionally may undertake the risk and impose the risk on others. But if it's an amateur situation, probably not. And similarly, Yitzchok has a tshuva about a game hunter, a Jew who wanted to engage. He writes that hunting is not a Jewish profession, but from the perspective of risk, it's acceptable. This is above the normal risk category. I'm talking about something much less risky than that. And it's an interesting debate. How risky does it have to become before it's not considered normal anymore? But this whole discussion pertains to things that are mutter. Okay. We are now taking a further step, things that become obligations because they're normal steps for protection.
Okay. Let me ask you a question. So what would you say halachically? A parent has a child who does have measles and sends them to school. What halachically is the parent being over?
I think he's being a mazik. This question, I think, applies even when kids are immunized. Let's say that everyone's responsibly immunized and a parent has a child with a dangerous infectious disease. knowing that a small percentage of the kids will be vulnerable. I think it's completely basic that you don't put others deliberately in danger. We're not talking about that. The debate is centered around whether you may send a well but unimmunized child to school.
Right.
From a
halachic point of view, sending a child to school who has an infectious disease, the parent would be, I guess, a mazik. What would you describe the parent at that point?
Absolutely. I can think of one exception, though, and that is in the case of chickenpox. It's been for a long time accepted that it's a good idea for children to get chickenpox when they're small. They tend to get it mildly, and it develops lifelong immunity. So without going into the question of whether they should be immunized against chickenpox or which immunizations I think are better and which are more dubious, that was a widely practiced norm. In fact, many parents, until very recently, were taking their children deliberately to play with children who had infectious chickenpox because the immunity is...
Rabbi Tatz, let me ask you, a parent, just a pure halacha question. Somebody you have an outbreak in a school and you find out that Mendel sent their son to school and or their daughter, they had chickenpox, and they had measles, and a bunch of kids caught it. Couldn't the parents obligate Mendel to pay for nezik tzari b'sheves baishes of their children or whoever continued to be infected by their child? What would you say?
I'm not able to answer that question. I'm not a posik. It's above my pay scale, as they say. I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, okay. No, just what would you say? Does a school or a shul have a right not to allow a non-vaccinated child, person, woman, male, etc., in as a member, or as a talmud, etc.?
Again, I can't answer as a posek. I'm a doctor and a person who's involved in outreach and teaching medical halacha, mainly in the outreach setting. To me, in my humble amateur opinion, it's obvious that a community can exclude a person who's dangerous to them. But I'm not a posek. You need to ask that in a formal setting. I've never investigated.
So here's another letter that came out from a letter to the community of Lakewood. It says, as Shomrei Torah mitzvahs, Menala must keep in mind that denying a child acceptance to school and forcing parents to vaccinate their children are against their will are decisions involving serious halachic shilos. Right? Setting school policy on this matter necessitates medical knowledge of the Metzias. Recently, in a letter addressed to Hagoyin Reb Chaim Kanievsky, Reb Chaim paskin that schools cannot refuse such children. This psak has been endorsed by many gedolim and poskim. I'm at loss to understand this. Like, how could you send a child to school unvaccinated, putting other children at risk? I just don't. Could you try to give me some color of what they're thinking?
This is really beyond my. I don't wish to get involved in a argument with gedolim who have paskened in this matter. I think it's a question of being a mazik, al-yidei groma. You're talking about. You're not. Previously, you asked me about sending in a child with active disease into a vulnerable population. I mean, that's criminal. Now you're talking about a child who's opted not to be immunized. There are a small minority of kids who are not anyway. There are always a small minority of children in whom the vaccine does not take anyway. This is a much more subtle question. You want my personal opinion? I think any community has a right to protect itself, whether it's a shul or a school, to protect its vulnerable children by excluding people who may be dangerous to them. But I'm not. Again, I must stick to the areas in which I'm qualified to speak.
Okay, now here's another letter that says that we have no right. Basically, the letter says you have no right to force. Parents have the right. This is honestly an astonishing letter. Parents have the right, once they've investigated the issue, to do what they believe is right, and that becomes their ushmartem es nafshesechem, to follow their gut instinct and their own personal investigation, notwithstanding what science says. This was a letter signed by a number of, sent out to the Lakewood community. What do you think of that?
I think that's just simply factually wrong. I mean, this is not a question of opinion. We have a very clear factual situation, whether we should have gotten into this, whether there's obligation to develop vaccines. These are all questions. But at this point in time, we are subject to the protection of the vaccine. If we drop that, and people have to realize this is a community effort. It's not an individual decision. This is the thing that only works across a community. Again, the way you break epidemics is by enough people being immunized. So it's not a question of what I think. I'm drilling the hole under the seat in my boat. Immunizations are a community effort. They only work that way. The theory, again, is to make transmission of an epidemic impossible. And for that, you need what they call the R factor in infectivity. For some diseases, 95%, for some diseases, 98%, but it depends on a communal effort. And the beauty of that communal effort is that if you do it adequately, you even protect the children who are unfortunately not immunized because the vaccine doesn't take, or because they're sick, or because they can't get the vaccine for whatever reason. So when people say, I have the right not to do it, it's not a personal question only exposing their child to danger, like this child that died in Yerushalayim this week. It's also a threat to the community. So it's a much broader question.
I'm just curious if a person has a right to say, we go against all of science because of my investigation. Like, would somebody be able to do halachically the same thing and say, look, I know all the Gedolim Rabbanim said electricity is asa, but my investigation leads me to believe that electricity is mutter. The same way you can repudiate all of medical, all medical knowledge and say, I, Zalman, decided that all of medicine is wrong and this is my personal investigation. That's my. Can I do the same thing halachically? I mean, is that what they're suggesting?
I don't think so. You know that Moshe Feinstein urged people to come to their own conclusions halachically when they're big enough to do so. But if you're an amateur medically to come to a medical conclusion that's completely against the facts, and indeed against the consensus of expert opinion, that is just foolish.
Here's another question. So I've had on a number of people, a rabbi from Lakewood today, or a parent from Lakewood, and basically I said, on what basis are you not vaccinating? He says, because I believe it causes autism. I said, we have 17 of the most prestigious journals in the world have said there's no link. I said, the CDC has come out with there's no link. The World Health Organization has no link. JAMA has done 90, what did they do, 65 or 95,000 patients, they think no link. And he said, everybody's paid off. He says, all the journals are paid off. It's a conspiracy. The journals are paid off. The doctors are paid off. The pharmaceutical companies are paid off the Senate. They paid off the House of Representatives. They paid off everybody, and it's all a huge conspiracy against parents. How do you respond to that?
I don't think there's a response. When it comes to conspiracy theorists, it's very difficult to break through. I think our efforts should be put into the people who are open and don't know. The people who have that sort of attitude, in my rich experience, no matter what you say, they don't change. I'll give you an example. I had a family a couple of years ago who the father insisted on giving mega doses of a certain vitamin to his whole family. I pointed out to him that particular vitamin in mega doses can cause fetal abnormalities if a woman gets it when pregnant. And I pointed out to him which abnormality. He continued giving his wife while pregnant. The child was born with that particular abnormality. When I said to the father, when the discussion came up again after the child was born, and I pointed out this fact, he said to me, can you imagine how bad it would have been if I'd not given it to her? In other words, I'm still right. This did not cause it. It would have happened anyway, and it would have been worse. Now, there's no way to get through logically to a person who is so fixated. And well known that conspiracy theorists are very, very fixed in. I'll tell you one of the ironies. They accuse the drug companies of profiteering in this area. And one of the real ironies is the drug companies, unfortunately, can be criticized for profiteering in many ways. But in vaccines, the irony is they make only pennies. In fact, some countries have had problems getting the vaccine manufacturers to continue manufacturing the vaccines because they don't make any profits from them.
In other words, you're saying if the kids caught meningitis, Rahman al-Atzman, or measles and ended up in the hospitals, the amount of drugs they would be using greatly exceed what they're spending on vaccines. So if anything, the pharmaceutical companies should be saying don't take vaccinations because we have medicines for all the disease that you will get if you're not vaccinated.
I never thought of an argument that extreme, but I suppose that makes sense too.
In closing, Rabbi Tatz, you say that you heard personally from Rabbi Yashiv that he said there's a chiyuv. You heard from a friend of yours who went to Reb Chaim Kanievsky who said the exact same thing. Is there any points that you feel we haven't covered that are important to note?
I think we've covered the main issues. I think people need to realize this is, again, a community effort. The science behind it is very good. Yes, there are one or 2 points. Let me make one. I think that in the extreme case that we could show a slightly higher incidence of a particular disease, autism happens to be a case in point where we know there's no high incidence. But even if we could find evidence that kids with whooping cough vaccine, for example, have a slightly higher rate of some complication, I think even in that case, society, our community, has a permission to say we accept that small risk because we're averting a greater one. And I think that's perfectly in line with Halacha. again, because it becomes a norm. So even if someone can come forward and show me that we have evidence that is a small danger, and we can show that the safety profile, the terrible dangers we're averting, far outweigh that. In fact, that has been the position throughout society with immunization. Today, the whooping cough vaccine is much better, but it was clearly known to cause a problem, and people accepted it. The reason was that the risk of an outbreak and death was much, much greater than that. And I think and once we conduct ourselves that way, Hashem runs the world according to those lines. This is clearly the gedder that the poskim have taken. So I think that's an important point as well. However, at the present time, we do not have evidence that there's any problem. And as I pointed out to you, we are seeing children now, and we'll see more of them, who are developing autism, for example, and have not had the vaccine. So, but again, I think that we are very unlikely to get through to the very vocal conspiracy theorist-oriented people. I think it's important to get through to the ones we can. And unfortunately, I think time is going to solve this problem.
I'll tell you a vart I heard once. I don't remember from who, but he said the mun fell by the door of the tzaddikim and far away from Rishayim. So Kairach had a big band of followers. So the question is, Kairach's mun must have fallen very far from his house. He was a Rasha, right? So why didn't his followers say, our Rebbe Kairach can't be so pious if he has to walk a half a mile for his mun?
Okay.
And he said, because Kairach said, aha, you know why I'm being punished? Because I didn't start up with Moshe even earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's
unfortunate.
So in closing, what would you say to a parent who doesn't want to or is considering not vaccinating their child?
Well, again, if it's a parent who's open to hearing the facts, I think it's important to give a little history and clear scientific background so they understand the issues. Many people I found are inadequately informed about the issues and the genuine risks. Clarify some statistical misconceptions. They need to know that indeed complications of the vaccines today are more, like polio, case in point, is more common than the disease. Only because we eliminated the disease, people fail to see that. I think when armed with the facts clearly, plus the fact that our poskim have clearly got in, again, not relating to the question of excluding children from school, but the obligation to do what is standard, I think that's true. I also make a side point, if I may, and that is that I think one of the things that is scaring parents today is that the American vaccination schedule is very extensive. You know, it's not just diphtheria, whooping cough, and polio. You know, it's a long list of diseases, including things that are quite offensive to us. You know, sexually transmitted disease prevention, things that many people in our community feel is unnecessary, a new vaccine, which we don't have that much information on yet. I think there's room to examine the schedule. Again, I don't want to point out which ones I think should and should not be given. I think we should respect people's sensitivity that any intrusion into the body, whether it's a drug or a immunization, has potential side effects. We know that. The Ramban says that what heals some kill others. This is a well-known thing. I think we should respect that. People's intuition that invasion of the body or giving medications or immunizations is a thing that should not be taken lightly. I think we should respect that. But point out to them that because of the Dashbo Rabim Shomei Psaim Hashem dimension, no harm will accrue to anyone who does what they ought to do. Let me, if I may, tell you a story in closing, which I think is very powerful, if I may.
Go for it.
Okay. There was a frum nurse assisting at a gynecological operation in Israel. Two secular gynecologists were operating on a woman, emergency surgery, removing an ectopic pregnancy. The nurse heard the one doctor say to the other while the woman was being operated on an anesthetic. He said, "This foolish lady, we told her to get sterilized. We told her pregnancy was too risky. She went to her rabbi. She considered the questions. She decided she wanted to risk the pregnancy. We were clearly right, and she was clearly wrong. She's in danger. She's losing one of her fallopian tubes. Foolish religious woman. She should never have listened to her rabbis. We were right, and she was wrong." The nurse was very perplexed. What do you say to a doctor like that? On the one hand, the woman made a decision. There was a psak she was given. It was mutter to enter the risk, and indeed she was experiencing danger. So she asked Rav Zilberstein, what should I have said? He said the principle is, and again, I'm not sure you could say this to the secular doctor, but the principle is you never escape harm coming your way by illegitimate means. If Hashem has earmarked you for a certain amount of tzoros, no illegitimate or halachically improper action will protect you. And conversely, if you do what you ought to be doing halachically, you will never suffer harm that was not coming your way anyway. And he gave the following illustration, and this you certainly cannot tell to a secular individual, but I'll tell you what he said. The Medrash says that there was a man who wanted to learn the language of the birds. He went to Shlomo HaMelech and he asked him to teach him. Shlomo Melech said, this is something you do not want to do. This is dangerous. This is not a thing to take lightly. But against Shlomo's advice, he pestered and he nagged and he begged him, and Shlomo taught him the language of the birds. Medrash says the man went out and he heard the birds say that his chickens were going to die. He quickly sold his chickens, and sure enough, they subsequently died. He was very happy. Then he heard the birds saying that his house was going to burn down. So he quickly sold his house, and sure enough, it burned down. Then he heard the birds saying he was going to die. He went back to Shlomo Melech and said to him, what do I do? Shlomo said to him, there was a gzera in Shemaim against you, a heavenly decree against you, and Hashem tried to take it out on your chickens. You got out of that, Hashem tried to take it out of your house, on your house. Now there's nothing I can do for you. Yeah. Okay, that was the measures that he used. In other words, families need to know that if they give a vaccine and the child gets autism or whatever happens to that child, this is not as a result of doing something that was halachically standard, let alone an obligation. But halachically standard, simply eating foods with modern additives, which many people are extremely averse to. There's no problem with doing it. Of course, if you don't feel well, you don't like to do it, there's no obligation to eat such foods, but there's certainly a heter. And therefore, Hashem is not playing games with us. He's not running our world according to hidden dangers that we have no way of knowing. Once it becomes known, smoking is known to be harmful, it's clearly awesome. All modern theists can agree that it's completely awesome. Even Moshe Feinstein 40 years ago would not allow you to pass the matches to a smoker, even though they didn't go much further than that at the time. Therefore, this is clearly conspiracy theorists, people without evidence, people taking extreme views of all sorts of fringe issues that are not, this is not the right way to go. Let me sum it up like this. Halachically, one is obliged to do what is normal. How many locks do you need on your door? What is normal? If people in your city have 2 locks on the door, if you have 1, that's negligent. And if you have 3, it's a lack of bitachon. That's the standard. Some areas one is allowed to have more bitachon or less ishtadlus. That's an area for discussion. But this is the basic standard. And it's inappropriate halachically. It's completely to grasp at straws and make extra ishtadlus in medicine, or to buck the standard that is the normal standard in these areas. It's not as inappropriate. It's the wrong focus of life. Life should be invested in Torah and mitzvahs and not in michoshesh for extreme things with very weak evidence. This is not the way to go, and certainly is not the medical way to conduct ourselves.
Rabbi Tatz, it's an honor having you on with us. Thank you so much for your time.
B'kasha, thank you. All the best.
We have on the phone with us from Redding, California, Dr. Brian Hooker, who is a PhD, an associate professor of biology at Simpson University in Reading. He also teaches chemistry at Shasta College. He is, I would probably say, the #1 anti-vaccine advocate in the United States. Is that a fair way to introduce you, Dr. Hooker?
Well, I appreciate that. I wouldn't quite call myself anti-vaccine. I don't like those labels because, my job is to interpret science and say, okay, this is what science is saying regarding vaccine safety. And I'm not a physician. So, I'm very, very careful. I don't give out medical advice to people because I'm not qualified. I'm not a medical doctor. And so what I like to do is I like to look at the science. I like to interpret the science, and with my background in epidemiology and statistics, and I feel like I can do that.
Okay, so Dr. Hooker, let's start at the beginning, because I imagine the majority of our audience does not know the history. Can you tell us just the history with Andrew Wakefield and the article? Just give us some perspective of what how it's all beginning.
Well, the beginning of what happened in modern times, which would be the Wakefield affair, started in about 1996 when Dr. Wakefield was working with John Walker Smith, who was the head of that particular research group at the Royal Free Hospital in London. He found an odd type of GI symptom in several patients who had been diagnosed with autism. And in that particular study, one of the things that he noted was the temporal association based on parental reports that the GI symptoms and the autistic symptoms were preceded by by the MMR vaccine. And so one of the things that he did within that paper was he mentioned that particular fact. He didn't really say not to vaccinate. He didn't really say that the MMR was causing autism because there wasn't that type of information within that particular case study. And it wouldn't have been appropriate for him. If he would have said, yeah, it's causing it, then that would have not been appropriate. And so, he continued to study regarding the MMR vaccine, and at the same time, at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, there became a concern about a mercury-containing preservative in vaccines called thimerosal. And thimerosal is not in the MMR vaccine. A lot of times it's easy to conflate those two issues, but thimerosal was formerly used in a lot of the infant vaccines in the United States, was phased out primarily between 2001 and 2004, but now is still in many of the flu vaccines, the influenza vaccines that are marketed even for pregnant women and infants. And so both of these, particular issues then were studied. They were studied by the CDC, and that's primarily where I've done a lot of my investigatory work. And regarding the MMR vaccine,
But Dr.
Yes.
Hooker, let's just follow up because I have from Wikipedia. So it seems that Andrew Wakefield at the time was a gastroenterologist and a physician.
That is correct. Yes.
And in 2000, and based upon his paper, a lot of people stopped immunizing. It caused a real panic when he found the linkage, or he claimed the linkage in his paper between autism and vaccinations, and it caused sort of a stampede. I think for a 6-year period, tens of thousands of people. But then in 2004, and my education goes to Wikipedia, Sunday Times journalist Brian Deere reported serious ethical violations in the 1998 paper, and he accused Wakefield of having been paid by a law firm that had been planning to sue vaccine manufacturers and subjecting some of the children to invasive procedures for the study. And afterwards, it says here, most of the researchers named as co-authors disavowed the findings. They withdrew their names from the paper. The Lancet, which was the journal that was published in, retracted Dr. Wakefield's paper. And then 3 months later, the Britain's General Medical Council revoked Wakefield's medical license, and he is now no longer Dr. Andrew Wakefield, but this is just plain Andrew Wakefield. This is from Wikipedia. Is this true?
Not exactly. There are a lot of flaws in what is written about that. If you go back to now, yes, absolutely, there was a lot of concern, and a lot of people stopped using the triple jab MMR, specifically in the United Kingdom, and that part is true. But if you go to the original Lancet paper, at no point in time did Dr. Wakefield or any of the co-authors make the association and say they merely said that there was a parental report, and the parental report was that the MMR vaccine preceded these gastro symptoms as well as autism. Now, the Lancet did retract that particular portion of the paper, and then they went on later on to retract the entire paper.
But he lost his medical license, isn't that true?
He did lose his medical license.
Is that common?
Not able to appeal.
How common is it to lose a medical license?
It's not common at all. I'm not going to lie to you. It's not a common occurrence. It is something, I think that, obviously, based on my information, I think that he was wrongfully struck off, and one of his co-authors who was also struck off, John Walker Smith, on appeal, was able to be reinstated. Dr. Wakefield never was not given the ability to appeal because of some issues with his malpractice insurance. But the one thing that Wikipedia doesn't state is that indeed John Walker Smith, who was brought up on the same charges as Wakefield, under appeal then was reinstated.
Well, I guess he wasn't the lead author, but here's what the British Medical Journal at the time, the BMJ, listen to this quote. I think it's a powerful quote. He says, the BMJ editor-in-chief, he says, it's one thing to have a bad study that is full of error. In this case, the picture is there was a deliberate attempt to create an impression by falsifying the data. Isn't that like a pretty strong conviction of
that's a strong assertion. However, it's never really been proven that the data were falsified. The BMJ did come out with that based on Brian Deere and then Brian Deere's investigation. But there were so many industry ties to Mr. Deere directly that it becomes very, very difficult to look at that and say, oh yeah, there's a lot of veracity there. The only particular thing that I have found that Dr. Wakefield did that could be under question was that he did blood draws at a birthday party, and that is, to me, that's facile. That's very, very facile. And again, we need to go back to that particular original paper. And despite what furor happened, Dr. Wakefield did not make a strong assertion or a strong connection between the MMR vaccine and autism. That was based on parental report. It was not based on his report.
So the BMJ's, that it was a deliberate attempt to create an impression through falsification of data, you would say is just not true?
I don't agree with it. I do not believe it's true. I've looked at this particular case. I am, by no means an expert on Dr. Wakefield, and I think that regarding vaccine safety, you can go down that rabbit trail and it becomes an ultimate red herring, because I am interested in the entire vaccination schedule, what's going on with the entire vaccination schedule, which I believe is understudied and has been understudied by the CDC and other prevailing authorities in other countries. And, at this particular point in time, there is not enough information to say, yeah, this particular vaccination schedule is safe. And so, we can talk about Wakefield more if you like.
But let's go to what you're saying now. So here's what, again, this is Wikipedia. Dozens of top journals, including the most prestigious in the United States, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of Pediatric Infectious Diseases, the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, and tons more, have all published papers that looked into a possible link and have found none. So as somebody who's just a layperson, and when my wife says, gee, should I vaccinate the child, I look online, I say, well, dozens of top journals, and these are the top ones in the United States, and I saw a quote someplace that said, there's not a single leading medical journal in the world that has found, that's published a paper that has found a definitive link. So and here's another one. A study in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, involved an analysis of 96,000 children. The authors wrote that their findings indicate no harmful association between MMR vaccine and autism spectrum disorder, even among children already at a higher risk. So my question is really, with so many prestigious journals printing this, there's always another opinion to everything. So as a member of the public, how seriously should we look at those that disagree with basically the main body of science?
I think that you need to look at the entire body of science rather than just these particular papers. If you look at the Journal of American Medical Association paper that you quoted, that particular paper was what's called a meta-analysis. It was not an direct analysis of children. It was an analysis of other papers that had been published. And if you look at the papers that they chose for this particular analysis, they only chose, there are papers that draw doubt regarding the MMR vaccine and regarding thimerosal in vaccines. And this particular paper in JAMA chose not to look at those particular studies. They only looked at studies that said that there was no relationship. But there's another body of evidence that shows a strong relationship, specifically between thimerosal-containing vaccines and the autism epidemic. There's about, if you look at the dangers of this particular preservative that is still in flu shots, if you look at those particular dangers, there's over 200 papers that are cited on PubMed, okay, that's the National Library of Medicine, that basically show that there's neurological harm associated with that type of exposure. And so, when you look at that,
there's just so much information here. So if somebody were to take a vaccine without thimerosal, would it be safe then?
I don't think that there's enough evidence to basically say that it's safe, because we have taken this particular conversation regarding all of the vaccines, 15 vaccines, different vaccines on the U.S. infant vaccination schedule, and we've distilled it down to, is MMR causing autism, and is thimerosal causing autism? So I think there's just not enough information on everything else. If you look at everything else...
But they said they did 95,000 children.
On the MMR only.
Okay, so let's just talk about MMR only. Would you agree then that the 95 children on MMR, including 15,000 unvaccinated 2 to 5 year olds, I have the JAMA study, I printed it out, and nearly 2,000, would you agree then on MMR that their paper is worth pending on?
There are multiple problems with that particular paper. Again, they cherry-picked the data. They did not look at analyses that showed that there was some type of relationship between the timing of the MMR vaccine and autism, including CDC's own study. CDC came out with a study in 2004, and if you look at the actual data, it showed that there was a relationship between the timing of the first MMR vaccine and autism specifically in males. And when you look at that, they reported that result. They said that it was there, and then they said, the only reason that these children got the MMR early is because they were shunted towards special education programs that require vaccination.
That's the famous with black children. But my question to you is there a reason to suspect that JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, would be tilted or lie or cherry pick or feed us like dishonest information?
Any journal like the Journal of American Medical Association or the journal Pediatrics, which is associated with the American Academy of Pediatrics, any journal that is underwritten, that receives money from the pharmaceutical industry or the vaccine industry, has an inherent conflict of interest.
What about the New England Journal of Medicine? Do they have an internal conflict as well?
Well, they do receive money from the pharmaceutical industry, so I would have to say yes. I mean,
so you would say that all 17 journals that they cite here are all basically
I don't have that list. I can't say that.
But it's just if you look on Wikipedia, that's the CDC's journal, or it's like the Alphabet City over here. You have to know all these names.
The CDC is a captured industry, and I'm doubtful of any scientist that comes out of the vaccine safety division of the CDC. I've investigated them for 17 years.
So my point is then, for us lay people, not to believe like the body of these, like the 17 journals that they list here, we have to believe that there's a conspiracy theory among them, and they're all being paid by the pharmaceutical industry to quelch data that is basically poisoning our children.
I think that you're getting a lack of information when you go on Wikipedia, and you're not getting the entire picture. I want you to consider all of the literature, considering all of the vaccination program, including a report from the Institute of Medicine in 2011 that said that they could not rule out a relationship between the DTaP vaccine and autism. So there are pieces of information.
It's very hard to prove a negative. All they could say is that we've done 95,000 children and we don't see it. But they can't prove that it's not there because you can't prove that something didn't happen. So they could say we did 95,000 children and we cannot find any proof. So can they absolutely disprove it? They can't disprove it. But they could say the 95,000 children. But I'm talking about, here's a study from the World Health Organization, WHO, global vaccine safety. They say, again, the same thing. Diseases have begun to disappear, right, before vaccines were introduced because of better hygiene and sanitation, they said, is a myth. And they write in this thing, they said the disappearance of disease is directly attributed to vaccines, and that there is no linkage between autism and either thimerosal or et cetera. I mean, this is WHO also right off the internet. So my question is, do we believe that the WHO is receiving money from the pharmaceutical companies and is party to a conspiracy?
I would have to look at that study. I'm unfamiliar with the study that you're talking about, but I would go back to the CDC study in 2003 on thimerosal-containing vaccines. And basically, the lead author of that study, who was a CDC employee, said that he could not prove or disprove a relationship between thimerosal and autism. And that was CDC's final word. CDC has said that study disproved the link between thimerosal-containing vaccines and autism. But if you actually look at what was written in the journal Pediatrics, it was indeed, based on the lead author's own admission, it was a neutral study. And so it was not proven, it was not disproven, but then there were many papers specifically regarding thimerosal that came out afterwards and showed that there was a strong link between thimerosal-containing vaccines and autism.
But it's true, but thimerosal is for the most part not used. Could you name a single study by a famous scientific body or a respected scientific body that has shown a linkage between autism and the MMR vaccine? Without thimerosal.
Without thimerosal?
Which is not used today.
Yes, I can.
Which one?
It's my own study. You know, my study was in the journal Translational Neurodegeneration before it was retracted, but I still stand by my work. Okay.
I understand, Doctor, but I'm talking about an independent body of a group of physicians that this is what they do, like one of the New England Journal, any famous that has come up with a study that shows a correlation between MMR and autism.
DiStefano, 2004, shows a statistically significant relationship. They dismissed it, but it is there in black and white in the journal Pediatrics.
But wasn't DiStefano relationship? But DiStefano the study was attacked and debunked, wasn't it?
No, DiStefano was never attacked and debunked. It was my reanalysis of DiStefano that was attacked. But this DiStefano study still stands, and even Dr. DiStefano himself was interviewed by Cheryl Atkinson in 2014, and he basically said that he stood by that result. But if you look at that paper closely, it shows in multiple instances that there were relationships, when children were getting the MMR early, specifically boys, not just black boys, but specifically boys, when they received the MMR vaccine early, they had a greater incidence of autism.
Well, so Doctor, I'm on Wikipedia, and here's what it says. DiStefano is an author of a number of scientific studies concluding that vaccines, in particular thimerosal, do not cause autism. In March 2013, for example, he was the lead author on a study in the Journal of Pediatrics which concluded that exposure of children to particular ingredients did not increase their risk of autism. In addition, DiStefano concluded that children with autism had received the same number of antigens. This study received wide. I'm just reading right off Wikipedia. So
I wrote a rebuttal in the British Medical Journal about that particular study that appeared in the British Medical Journal's website. It's fatally flawed because of a statistical problem called overmatching. There was no difference between the number of antigens that the cases and the controls had. There was absolutely no difference, and there's no basis for comparison to say that. I'm sorry, that particular paper DiStefano did was used a vaccine that's no longer on the market.
So, Doctor, I accept what you're saying, but I just want to reiterate the question: is there any independent scientific study that's respected that has found a linkage between autism and MMR?
Autism and the MMR? I do have to
go
back
to
the without the
Which one?
Again, the MMR does not have thimerosal on it, but the final word regarding the MMR vaccine is the DiStefano 2004 study, and
But I just read it. But I just read it.
You read DiStefano 2013. That's a different study. It has nothing to do with the MMR.
So did he change his mind? Is that it?
No, he didn't change his mind. He misinterpreted the results of the MMR study. Said if you look at the results, they show a definitive relationship, but in his conclusions, DiStefano said there was no relationship with the MMR vaccine.
So let me reiterate it. Is there any is there any accepted scientific journal or group of body of scientists that have concluded that there is some type of a linkage, a direct linkage between MMR and autism?
Now, if you look outside of DiStefano, nobody's going to do that. You know, if you do that, you've got to understand you'll have your career ended. And so, therefore, nobody is studying the MMR vaccine because, number one, CDC says the science settled, even though their own study shows that there's a relationship. And nobody is going to come down and say that the MMR is causing autism. You have to look at that from a standpoint, and please don't use that as a soundbite against me. That is basically I'm not saying that there isn't a relationship. Honestly, I haven't studied the MMR to the extent where I would say that we don't need further research. We need further research on the MMR vaccine. My own study that has been accepted and will be appearing in print basically shows that when you reanalyze DiStefano's data, there is a relationship statistically.
Okay.
So
now, Doctor, there is another doctor who appeared on your movie, Mark Geyer.
Oh, Dr. Geyer.
Dr. Geyer. And he was a self-employed American physician. Again, my information is only from Wikipedia. And he's a controversial professional witness who has testified in more than 90 cases regarding vaccines. His medical license was also suspended and revoked in every state, I'm reading from Wikipedia, in which he was licensed over concern about his autism treatment and his misrepresentation of his credentials to the Maryland Board of Health. So my question is that should the public be weary at all? Wakefield lost his license for what was considered by many to be an elaborate fraud. Geyer lost his license. There isn't a single journal that has concluded that there's a conclusion. So I ask you, as somebody who would advise the public,
there are journals that have concluded that there is a relationship between thimerosal and autism. If you look
without
at the
thimerosal, because DiStefano denies it himself, but there may be somebody else. I didn't get a chance to go through all of it.
Okay,
so
and if you look at aluminum, there's an entire body of evidence showing that aluminum vaccines is causing autism. So you need to look at everything.
But I want to look at MMR because it's sort of the mother of them all. Because we have a measles epidemic right now in New York. That's what's creating the interest in this. And the measles epidemic does not have thimerosal in it, the vaccine, or does have any aluminum, et cetera. So my question would be if somebody were to give their child an MMR vaccine today in New York, which is where the measles epidemic is, given that there is no single body that has concluded, and anybody who was associated with basically lost their medical license, fraud, etc., should anybody look at the dangers of measles, which I think 1 in 4 children with measles end up in the hospital, 1 in 1,000, 2 in 1,000 die, many end up with many different types of diseases. Should somebody say, do I believe the 17 journals that have published on this, or look with curiosity at the 2 physicians who've espoused it, both of whom have lost their license? How would you, as an independent, advise these people?
Okay. Well, let's go back to Dr. Geyer. There are several things that were omitted when you look at Wikipedia that are basically his case is still under litigation, and at this point, he has been awarded, because of misconduct by the Maryland Board of Physicians, he's been awarded $2.5 million. I mean, and so the case is still under litigation.
I didn't see that.
You're not going to find that on Wikipedia. No, it's not published on Wikipedia, and I entreat you to expand your search beyond these particular soundbites.
But
Dr. Geyer never studied the MMR vaccine. Dr. Geyer never studied the MMR vaccine. So it doesn't say that
in Wikipedia. And by the way, Wikipedia is markupable. So I guess if you sent me the information, I could have my admin type it in. Just where that is, I would be more than glad to do it, because if he's being besmirched, it's not kindly. But there is some other article, and Wikipedia continues. A judge ruled that Geyer represented himself as an expert witness in areas where he has no training, expertise, and experience. On other cases, judges have labeled his testimony as intellectually dishonest, not reliable, wholly unqualified. Another judge wrote
those
that
are special masters in the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. They're not judges. They're administrative officials that have said that. Wikipedia has misquoted that particular point, and it uses the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which is, quite frankly, a program that's set up not to find a causal relationship between vaccines and neurodevelopmental issues. Okay, so that is not, it's not a judge. It's absolutely not a judge.
But doctor, I've been sued. You know, anybody in business in the United States has been sued, and there are lawyers just running around like with a hammer looking for a nail to bang in. Wouldn't it be like the mother lode of all lawsuits if indeed this is the case, and it's this very big conspiracy to cover it up? Let's unleash all these lawyers on the incredibly wealthy pharmaceutical industry, get some people who are not into this theory but are interested in actually protecting our children, and denude these companies of everything they own because of this mass body of lies. Why don't we do that?
It's ongoing. There's not a whole lot I can comment on. But number one, you cannot sue vaccine manufacturers in the United States. That was made very, very clear by a ruling called Brucewitz versus Wyeth. And in that particular ruling, there is no recourse. The only recourse that you have if you have sustained a vaccine injury is to go through the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. You know, people have tried. There have been class action suits against pharmaceutical companies, but the jurisdictions basically rule, and they throw them back into what a very, very flawed National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So, there is no lawsuit there because of our laws, and that's one of the reasons why you don't see a large class action suit.
So but doctor, fraud pierces the veil of protection if there would be true fraud, right?
Okay, and absolutely there are cases that are going on based on fraud.
Dr. Hooker, it's been an honor speaking to you, and I thank you so much for your time.
I do appreciate the interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We have on the phone with us from Lakewood, New Jersey, Dr. Nochum Indich, who's a pediatrician in Lakewood for the last 20 years. 30 years. He's also a big Talmud Chacham. He's a Talmud of Telz. He learned in Kollel and Telz. He's a Musmach of Reb Chaim Stein, Reb Gifta, Reb Baruch Sorotsky, and Zechariah Levracha. He was a Chavrusa of Reb Pesach Stein for 4 years. He then went to medical school, to one of the best medical schools in the country, Ace Western Reserve University, and did his internship at Cleveland Clinic, certainly one of the best hospitals in the United States. Welcome, Reb Nochum.
Thank you very much for the introduction. What can I do for you?
So, Dr. Indich, there's been an outbreak of measles in Lakewood now. I read it's something like 7 cases or 8 cases. And it seems that many people are not getting vaccinated because, they fear autism and these other claims, etc. So as a doctor in Lakewood, can you give us a little bit of a feeling for what's going on the ground, and B, as to what is your feeling about the whole vaccination controversy?
Okay. First of all, there's an excellent book called Vaccines in Your Child by PAwith. It answers all the questions and answers all the tinnitus that people have and the concerns that they have about vaccines. I highly recommend it. It's very inexpensive. I can't do better than what the book says. I've been very involved with this for many years, aside from the medical side, on the Halacha side. I've been involved speaking to Gadol and different Paiskim about vaccines, and the schools have the right or responsibility to exclude children who aren't vaccinated to protect the other children. I have documentation for all the psukim that I'm telling you, some in writing and some in other ways. It's available to Askanim or Abonim if they would like to have the packet. From the list of Abonim, Paiskim, who hold that you should vaccinate, is Rav Elyashiv, Rav David Morgenstern, who's a Dayan by Rav Elyashiv, was a Dayan by Rav Elyashiv. I knew him from Telz, actually, and he went to the number one He went to MIT in Boston. He has a degree there. That's probably the number one science institute in the world. So he understands science, and he brought a family to. So he has B'Shem Rabbi Yashiv that you should vaccinate children. Rabbi Akiva Tatz, that everybody's famous. He was a doctor Dr. Rabbi Tatz. He took a family to Rabbi Yashiv who were concerned about vaccines and the side effects. He said they should be vaccinated because that's the normal thing that people do. This is available in Rabbi Akiva Tatz's book on dangerous medical procedures and risks in medical procedures. We have a Kol Kaireh signed by Rav Belsky, Rav First from Chicago, and from Rav Gissinger, Rav Gabriel Finkel, Simcha Bun Makon, that states that the schools have the right, that children should be vaccinated, and schools do have the right to vaccinate children. We have a psak from Sternbach from several years ago, and a new letter that just came out from him during this epidemic, in which he says that every person, every father should be concerned to give vaccines to his children right away, because we have an epidemic that's spreading, and the father is not a bias, does not have a bias to withhold the vaccine, especially because it's chav lecherem, it affects other people. And we have a psak that just came out from Rav Zilverstein and 4 other dayanim that says, the Torah says, the Torah nitna reshus the rodef the rapos the mitzvahi b'chal pekuch nefesh. If you menea asma, if you refrain from giving it, the harizeh shayfech domim. Other rabbanim who pass like this.
Right. So, Rabbi, Dr. Indich, let me just ask you a question. Yeah. The epidemic is measles.
Right.
Rabbi Zilberstein says it's pikuach nefesh. I mean, the odds of dying from measles are exceptionally remote, aren't they?
Statistically, if we had no children vaccinated in Lakewood, and there'd be 5,000 children who would catch the measles, if there's no vaccination, up to 90% of children can catch it, there could be anywhere from 10 to 20 deaths per epidemic. There's also permanent brain damage that can occur, and another disease that 7 to 10 years later, they develop a multiple sclerosis type disease that the brain just stops working and they die. So there is risk to it. So we always look at risk and benefits. There's risk to not vaccinate, and there's some risk to vaccinate. The risk of crossing this of driving your car is significantly greater than this risk. Rabbi Yashiv says that you're not concerned about the risk because this is what people do. This is what the doctors recommend. You have to who decides which is a better risk or benefit? It's the doctors. 99% of doctors say one thing. The halacha, the rabbanim paskin based upon what the doctors say, and then that's your shtadlus. Hashem yazor. Akiva Tatz asked Rabbi Yashiv, what should a doctor feel if he damages a child or a child dies from a vaccine? He says that's b'shert. And that's
but Dr. Indich, what are the odds? From all the literature I've read that the most serious proven complication that can come, which are very rare, is swelling. That could be a shock that the child could go into, which means they would have to be given
side effect from what? Side effect from what?
Yeah, so and they say that these are very remote.
Side effect from vaccine or from not for the disease?
No, side effects of vaccine would be what?
Yeah. Is that what your question was about?
Yes, my question is, what is this possible side effects of vaccine that have been proven by modern science?
Very little. I will. There are all sorts of issues. I can go into particular issues just to show you how the mistakes that people make. People want to say that it causes diabetes. Studies show that it doesn't. People complain about vaccines. For example, they complain that there are harmful products in the vaccine. For example, they complain about mercury in vaccines. The truth is that mercury is part of the Earth's surface, and it's all over. You get exposed to it on a daily basis. A breastfed child will get 400 micrograms of mercury in the first 6 months of life. That's more than twice that was ever contained in all the vaccines combined. People make mistakes. There are two types of mercury. There's methylmercury and ethylmercury. Just like we have ethyl alcohol and methyl alcohol. Ethyl alcohol is vodka, or the alcohol that we drink. We know certainly that it's not the healthiest thing to drink, but you can drink it. The body processes it, and you're fine as long as you don't do too much chronically. Then there's methylmercury. Methylmercury is the mercury that stays in your body, and that's the one that causes difficulty. Just like there's methyl alcohol, and methyl alcohol, you drink any substance of that, you get liver failure and and blindness, and eventually it kills you. So the type of mercury that everybody's complaining about is that methylmercury is the one that is the problem, and that's not in the vaccine at all. And methylmercury is passed out of your system; it does not build up. So this is a big mistake that when people don't understand science or chemistry talk about this. They make mistakes. Aluminum. They complain about aluminum.
Well, but Dr. Indich, what are realistic side effects of a virus, of a vaccine? Let's not talk about a little swelling, local swelling, sometimes fever. Very rarely febrile seizure, which is no consequence. These are all when you look at the risk of from vaccinations, there's a getter of Shomer Hashem. If it's in such a small frequency, you're not mechuyev to be concerned for that, and you do. But Dr. Indich, from what you're saying, even if it does occur, it's a trivial or minor consequence. Is that correct?
Right. Exactly.
Okay. So let me ask you: have you seen the consequences of people who have not been vaccinated? Have you ever encountered that?
You can't come to my practice if you're not vaccinated. But I will tell you that I had a patient when I was practicing in Cleveland that presented with a seizure disorder that they blame on vaccines 2 days before his vaccines. Now, if we wouldn't have diagnosed that, which wasn't easy, then he would have gotten his vaccines and we would have blamed it on the vaccines.
My point is, do you know cases of children who have either had gotten severely ill or adults because they were not vaccinated and they ended up in the hospital because of the measles, or they died because of the measles, or one of the other many diseases they give vaccines for? Pneumonia,
we hear it in the news. We hear it in the news all the time. Baruch Hashem, I haven't had to see even a case of measles. There was a child in Lakewood who was unvaccinated and developed at 18 months and developed a bacterial meningitis that the vaccine and died. And the vaccine prevents that 99% of the time. The hospital had not seen this case in 20 years since they started the vaccine.
So this was a child who was not vaccinated and came down with bacterial meningitis, which a vaccine would have eliminated,
yes.
And the child died because of it.
Yes.
And why was the child not vaccinated?
Because the doctor discouraged the parents from getting the vaccine.
Let me ask you: you're a musmach of three, G'dayli Olam. What is the halachic chiyuv to get vaccinated?
As I said before, it's halachic chiyuv is u'shmartas nafshaseichem, and this is brought down in Psakim. And how do you decide when you have a controversy between two sides? What is the safe thing medically to do? It's when you paskin following what the roiv ruba of the doctors paskin. You don't worry about conspiracy. You don't paskin against conspiracy that is poorly founded.
Now, Dr. Indich, if a parent has a child who has the measles and sends them to school, I mean, what halacha would they be? Would they be a mazik? What status would you give this child or the parent to do something like this? Well,
he's a potential mazik if somebody catches the disease. We have several things. Okay, there's a video of Rav Chaim Kanievsky that I witnessed. It's available to see on a private basis. He was asked whether you should vaccinate children. He said yes. He's asked whether schools have the right to exclude children. He said yes. They asked, can somebody taina that since you're vaccinated, why do you care if I'm vaccinated? He said no. You can't. And what about side effects? Says Yad Hashem.
But Dr. Indich, the yeshiva gave out a letter a number of years ago from Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and in which he says, and it's signed by all the Rosh Yeshivas. They said they spoke to Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and Reb Chaim Kanievsky said, I'm sure you've seen that letter, that a school does not have a right not to accept a child who's not vaccinated. Is that consistent with the video that you have?
The video came out after that. I was by Reb Chaim Kanievsky also, and there's a son of Shimon Becher who lives in town, was by Reb Chaim Kanievsky with Reb Zilberstein after this point. They brought up vaccines and schools, and Reb Chaim said, these children are mazikim, you should kick them out of school. Now, I can explain the whole thing about the letter. The letter with the shiloh as follows. There was a child who developed leukemia and needed chemo. Therefore, he'd be vulnerable to unvaccinated children. So he wasn't going to go to school, but he had siblings in the school. So the concern was whether the siblings, they're vaccinated, they can pick something up. This is possible, just not 100%. Whether that's a risk enough that you should exclude that child from the school for that reason. And he said no. Now, all this information, you can speak to the people, you can see the video yourself. This was done after the fact.
So the letter that was given out by Smedrish, it's an inaccurate quote of Reb Chaim Kanievsky.
It's a particular case, and it's taken out of proportion, out of context. But we have a video, and I saw it, and it's available. If you're down here, you can see it also. It's available. I will tell you that you just have to hear the names of everybody who's talking. You should take vaccines. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Reb Zilberstein, Reb Belsky, Reb Meir Stern will exclude you from school. You passing in Passaic. He says there's a risk of crossing the street also. There's a risk of life. You cannot get into school in Passaic. There was a Bezdin in Baltimore. Bezdin in Baltimore decided the same. And we hope that the Halacha follows 99% of what the doctors say. And Shlomo Miller also signed on to this. And Osher Weiss gave last year there was a good ahead in Eretz Yisrael, something in Pekuch Nefesh, and he got up in public. Actually, doctors were able to ask questions, so I presented a question to the panel to give in to him. He got up in public and said, "You please take vaccines. Schools have the right and should exclude." And he also said that from two rayas, he said that a person, if there's a takana for the community, for the protection of the community, everybody has to do that. No one has the right to exclude himself by the fact of saying somebody else did that.
Now, Dr. Indich, the video that you said, is there a reason you wouldn't release it to the public?
I don't have the video, and the author does not. The author said that when I saw it a few years ago, he said anybody can come and see it if they want. Certainly, Rabbanan and Paiskim, I'd be happy to go in with them, but he did not want, much to my chagrin, he did not want to put it out public. I heard it in my own ears, and so did he, and I have Adis from Shimon Becher. You can call him up. He said people can call him up and ask him. He's not going to argue the issue. He'll just tell you what he heard. And this was after. This was after.
Dr. Indich, all the ksavim of the Rabbanim who you mentioned who say it's a chiyuv, would you allow us to copy it and put it up on our website?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I welcome it. Highly welcome it. I have a whole file. I gave a share on this once before in my hometown in Cincinnati, and I have a whole file, and I'm happy to share it with you. There's a whole history to the file that I would maybe like to explain to you at some point, but I have the file with the raw data and the rayas and the psukim.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to speak to a doctor and a Talmud Chacham.
Thank you very much.
Take care, Colt.
We have on the phone with us from Lakewood, New Jersey, Rabbi Yitzchok Gottesman. He is an expert in health care in the respect that he promotes health sharing as a type of a health plan. He's a Talmud of Koil of Even Ezer. He's a Musmach. Welcome, Rabbi Gottesman.
Reb David, it's a great cover to speak to you.
Rabbi Gottesman, you don't vaccinate your children. And the question would be is, why not?
Well, there was a time that I did vaccinate my children. In fact, until my oldest was 11 years old, all of my children were just about fully vaccinated. And there were repercussions to this. 2 of my 3 children had recurring ear infections that required tubes. And this is considered quite normal. Chronic illness in our culture is considered quite normal. But there came a time that, people started asking questions. There was an interview by Dr. Meir Eisenstein, a frum doctor from Chicago. And it came a time that we decided maybe we shouldn't just go with the flow. Maybe we should look into this question much deeper. And we spent quite a bit of time, my wife and I, looking into the question from both sides. And it became clear to us that the way to go for our family is to a more holistic, natural lifestyle for our children. It was the best decision we've ever made.
Okay.
From that time, 2012 till today, we have not needed to see a doctor for any reason. We've achieved optimal health.
Rabbi Gottesman, well, let me ask you a question. The vast body of science, right, and I say it's 99% of science, 99.9, believe that inoculations are important to prevent disease. We've had 3 major advocates for non. It started with Andrew Wakefield, the British doctor who was found to falsify information. He lost his medical license. The next big advocate was this Dr. Geyer, who lost his medical license. Multiple judges said that he was a liar. He was a professional witness on many different cases. And the current big advocate, who we interviewed actually, was Dr. Hooker, who the court also found to be lying when he sued. And these are courts in different jurisdictions, different countries, whole different. So there's the vast body of science against 3 people, all of whom have been called liars by different judges, different courts, different depositions. They contradicted each other. I mean, how do you follow what is basically a conspiracy theory versus, the body of science? That's what I would ask you. I mean, there are people who don't do chemotherapy. They use rosemary oil and they smoke incense. And would you advocate that for somebody who's battling cancer? At what point do we say, witch doctors, snake oil salesmen should not, we live in a time, yes, we get into a car, and when you turn the ignition, it's not a Memphis that the car rolls forward. So at what point do we say the vast body of science should bear weight over a claim that has been everybody who's been in, there's not a single, this is from Dr. Hooker, not a single medical journal, and there are 100 medical journals, major medical journals, that has come out with a conclusive study that showed any link with autism to MMR, etc. So based upon all that, and additionally, since you're a Muslim, I'll ask you halachically, the Shulchan Aruch says in 2 places, in Shin Chav Ches and in Tav Reish Ches, that when you comes to either Chil Shabbos or to Yom Kippur, you follow the majority of Reifim. So my question to you is, knowing that measles has a 25% chance of landing a kid in the hospital, that encephalitis follows measles, chronic ear, how do you halachically follow what is basically a group of debunked physicians against the majority of medicine, both halachically, morally, logically? That's my question.
Excellent question. Okay, so let's start with the halachically, because halacha is very important, but in order to get to the halacha, it is vital that you have clarification and clarity in the mitzias of the shaila. So halacha begins with the mitzias. So if you present a halacha shaila and only having half of the mitzias, only having half of the shaila, then that's not halacha. So let's start with the vast majority. That's the way it has been in the past, and I can guarantee that's the way it is always going to be, because so-called science is actually mostly produced by the drug companies themselves for the purpose of promoting their products. So we have to decide what is science. A doctor comes out of medical school. For example, I believe you're going to be interviewing a pediatrician. Okay, is when he says opinion about vaccines, I believe that it is in the best interest of children and then all children should be vaccinated. Okay, so we take that into consideration. We listen to him. We listen to his advice. But the questions we should be asking themselves, does this pediatrician have the ability to say, you know what, it's not that important. What would happen to that doctor? So I'll tell you what would happen to that doctor. Very soon, he would lose his medical license because that's the medical board is going to make him lose his medical license. Very soon, he will have to declare bankruptcy because he spent hundreds of thousands.
Hello, but you're really going down a rabbit hole. Individual doctors don't have the research tools to decide these things, right? When you have the Journal of American Medical Association did a study of 76,000 children. I mean, individual doctors are not coming up with cancer cures. They're not coming up with disease cures. An individual doctor knows how to give a needle and how to do a diagnosis of an ear infection.
Excellent. Good point.
This is really not playing in. But when you have, there was recently 17 different medical journals did studies, and they're not afraid of, they're not going to lose their medical license. And the contrary,
they're going to lose all of their advertising.
No, I don't.
In fact, they wouldn't exist anymore.
Can I ask you a question? When do you believe the tobacco companies? Do you believe tobacco is dangerous? Do you know the amount of advertising tobacco did? Asbestos companies did, and yet they were both put out of business or substantially impacted in the United States because the legal profession is a wonderful watchdog for this. So why do you think that the vaccination the drug companies behind this market cap or clout is greater than either tobacco or asbestos, two industries that were put onto their heels because they were discovered to have done things that were actually damaging to people's health?
There's a very specific answer to that because in 1986, they ran over to Congress and said, we're being sued so much for our DPT shot. So many children have been killed. So many children have been permanently brain damaged. We cannot continue into business, and we're going to close shop because we're losing more money in these lawsuits than any profit we could possibly get in the future. So Congress got together and they said, oh my gosh, we can't let these companies go under. And they made a law that says from now on, you can no longer sue any vaccine company for anything. If
Without
you give
going
a child
to the
a shot,
well, you have to go to the vaccine court. It's a special court.
It's a special court, Makes things as difficult as possible for anyone to get compensation.
Okay. So it's a conspiracy.
Let's talk about tobacco. That's
wait.
Thing.
You say it's a conspiracy by the drug companies and by Congress.
To sell their products. Yeah.
So, and Congress is also in on this conspiracy.
Absolutely. Congress is
Senate
bought and sold.
Right. So the Senate and the House are also all in on this conspiracy against their own children.
Their financial backing comes from the drug companies, massive amounts. This is well known, well documented, and it's what is known as the revolving door.
It's well documented that the pharmaceutical companies have bought off all of Congress.
Just about, yes.
Okay.
There are a couple of exceptions, very, very rare.
Rabbi Gottesman, do you believe, it's well known that aliens landed in Arizona, and that it's a well known, and that it's a conspiracy by the U.S. government not to disclose that? Do we believe in that?
I don't know anything about aliens. What I know about is that
do you believe that 9/11 happened by Zionist forces? There's a huge conspiracy in all the Arab countries. 9/11 was done by the Zionists, and it was not an Arab plane. It was actually full of Zionists to blow up, to create a war against and bad feelings against. What point do we say?
Well, we don't know.
Reality has to intrude on our. What about the journals? There are 17 medical journals that in the last 4 years have done studies and come out that there is absolutely no linkage. Are they also bought off by everybody?
Not only they bought off, 100% of their advertising dollars comes from the drug industry.
Many of them They don't take advertising dollars. The New England Journal of Medicine does not. So if I were to show you a number of these medical journals that take no advertising dollars, would that change your mind?
Where do these writers come from? Where do they get money from? Who supports the universities?
If we could, they're also supported by trial lawyers associations as well, right? So if I could
not
show
anymore.
you,
there's no more money in vaccine trials.
Rabbi Gottesman, if I could give you a list of the journals that do not take any dollars from pharmaceutical companies,
no such
would
thing.
You change
the
your
journal,
mind?
No such thing. Doesn't exist.
Okay.
The source of this information.
Are we to believe then that the Zionists actually were the ones who caused the bombing of 9/11?
We don't know who caused the bombing of 9/11. One thing we do know is that it wasn't 19 terrorists flying airplanes using box cutters. That we know 100% clearly. If you were to research the subject,
it was not.
Come to the same. No.
Who was it?
Absolutely
who was
impossible.
It?
It's not important who it was. It's not important who it was. It's important who it wasn't, and it's important to open up your mind to the information that you're fed and to see both sides of a question. Yes,
so
it is important.
You're saying that in effect, it wasn't the 19 terrorists who did the bombing of 9/11.
Impossible.
So I'm curious, who do you think did it?
It's not important. That side of the question is a secondary question.
So
the most important thing is that when you're fed information, do you have the ability to think critically about information that you are fed? When you turn on the television, you turn on the internet.
Rabbi Gottesman, what is the alternative theory to 9/11?
It's not important for this discussion. It's not important what happened. It's important what didn't happen.
Okay.
And
so
then
it
when it comes time,
it was not the Saudi bombers who did that.
No, impossible.
It was impossible for it to be the Saudi
impossible
bombers.
For them to have taken over those planes and the way it was done. No, that's not the story. No, we are missing information in 9/11. Absolutely.
So we believe then that the government is indeed covering up the alien landings that have occurred in the deserts on the West Coast?
I don't know anything about alien landings. All I know is about when I'm focused on the health of my children, my mind is open. I start off by listening to what the pediatrician says, to what the government agent says, and from the medical trade association. That's where my research begins.
Okay.
And from
so the
there,
CDC
I move off to...
So the
absolutely.
CDC
they've been caught with their pants down so many times. I can't even begin to tell you. Yes, they're lying. In fact, almost everything they say, they're lying.
So
when they started fighting against Mitzitza Bepeh, didn't you see their mouths were full of lies? Yes, they lie a lot. Government agencies cannot be relied upon. Yes.
So the CDC doesn't take any money from pharmaceutical companies. Do we believe that?
Not only do they take money from pharmaceutical companies, they are patent owners themselves.
The CDC is funded by taxpayers. We're just arguing.
That's not accurate.
Sir, the CDC is funded by taxpayers.
Oh, and the head of the CDC, where did he come from? What was his previous job? And when he leaves the CDC, I'll tell you, he comes from the drug company. It's called the revolving door. Revolving door. Drug company goes into the CDC. 2 years later, when his stint is over, back out, back to the drug companies. Yes, it is a legislative branch of the pharmaceutical industry.
So the CDC is bought off. Is the World Health Organization?
It is a branch of the pharmaceutical industry, yes.
So the World Health Organization is bought off too?
Absolutely. Absolutely it is.
JANA, the Journal of American Medical Association, is bought off too?
Absolutely bought off by the drug industry.
Okay.
It is the most powerful, richest industry.
Okay. The New England Board of Medicine also bought off?
I don't know what the Board of Medicine is. I know what the New England Journal is.
The New England Journal of Medicine also bought off?
Absolutely bought off.
The Journal of Pediatric Medicine bought off.
Absolutely supported by pharmaceutical industry.
The U.S. Senate is bought off by the pharmaceutical industry?
Absolutely.
Congress is bought off. Now the big law firms.
Welcome to planet Earth.
So I'm asking you, the big law firms that have not sued, have they also been bought off?
There's nothing to sue because they are protected now with the 1986 vaccine law. You cannot sue them.
Well, fraud.
If they could sue, they would have all been bankrupt decades ago. They would be gone. Merck would be gone. GlaxoSmithKline would disappear. If they could sue them for the clear evidence of damage to children, they would have been gone decades ago. History.
Do you, Rabbi Gottesman, believe in general in the conspiracy theory that there are many things that the government is controlled by a small group of people, that and really voters don't have, it's really a small cabal that control the U.S. government?
Whether it's a small cabal or a large cabal, you have to know that the government doesn't necessarily have only your best interests in mind. There are powers behind it. Yes, absolutely. Okay. The whole voting thing is just to get you involved and excited about, I'm participating and, I give them my endorsement. Yeah, it doesn't really make a difference whether Democrats or Republicans win. It's basically headed in one direction. I think that should be clear to everyone.
So I have a question for you. And this was a question put to me by Rabbi Akiva Tatz.
Sure.
I said many people believe, or shouldn't say, many of the people who are anti-vaccine believe that it's a conspiracy by the drug companies. Right? They're huge conglomerates. They're multi-billion-dollar, Roche, Johnson & Johnson. And he asked me the following question, and I didn't have a response to him. He said the cost of a vaccine, he said it's pennies. Let's say it's not pennies. It's $100, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the cost of treating the diseases that come from it, let's say pneumonia, right? 25% of children who have measles end up with pneumonia. The cost of treating a pneumonia is over $6,000.
Okay.
He says if you're the drug company, would you rather sell $6,000 worth of drugs or $100 worth of drugs?
you realize there is no drug for the measles, right? But it's not treated with antibiotics.
Yeah, but it's true. But the byproducts, pneumonia, comes from it, right? The cost of treating pneumonia is an average nationally. You can look it up on Wikipedia. Is $6,000 for your child. What would you rather do? Sell $6,000 of pneumonia drugs or $100 of measles drugs? That was his question.
What is the cost of the treatment of an autistic child per month?
Wait. Now you're assuming that there's autism. But I'm saying
there are risks in vaccines. The Supreme Court of the United States has said that vaccines are unavoidably unsafe, which means that it has been well established that it causes all kinds of other developmental immune system and all kinds of mental problems. It's been established by the Supreme Court.
No. That is you're misparsing things. You really misparsing. There is not a single credible journal. We heard this from Dr. Brian Hooker. Not a single one. There are 37 journals have done studies on it that connects autism to vaccines. They did 96,000 children, JAMA did. So if it's because of now encephalitis is a byproduct of the measles. The cost of treating encephalitis is $54,000. So if you're a pharmaceutical company, your attitude should be, let's not vaccinate, let them get encephalitis.
So I think
hearing loss, right? He says, from measles, 1 out of 20 kids will have hearing loss. The cost of hearing loss, and you can read this online at hearit.economiccostofhearingloss.com on the internet, is $300,000. So I ask you, you're a pharmaceutical company. You can make a couple of bucks on a vaccine, or you could make tens of thousands on encephalitis, hundreds of thousands on hearing loss. I would be out there if I was a pharmaceutical company saying, stop vaccines, no more vaccines. There's a famous maxim, an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. Stop the prevention and let's let the drug companies make a fortune. That was Rabbi Tatz's question.
Very important subject that he's bringing up, which is, really we should have started with this. Which strategy brings to the overall better health of children? A strategy of vaccinating or a strategy of holistic and natural health? So it's very easy to do this. What you mean to ask, Reb David, is will this bring to a healthy child? Okay, so let's take 1,000 children who have been vaccinated, and let's take 1,000 children who are living a more holistic, natural lifestyle and have not been vaccinated, and what is their overall healthcare expenditure? So based on what you're saying, you would assume that the 1,000 children who have been unvaccinated have much, much higher healthcare expenditures. They're in the hospital all the time, and they have all kinds of chronic health problems, while the vaccinated are strong, robust, and healthy, and they barely ever need a doctor.
But there are no
basically
studies.
What you're saying?
No. I'm saying that MMR, let's take
saying.
one particular vaccine, right? The vaccine is a couple of bucks to administer. The diseases that directly correlate to it, that if you go online, you say it's not if, it's not when, 25% of the kids end up in the hospital, 10 to 20% end up with pneumonia, 4% end up with encephalitis. These are diseases that 1,000 times P-elif are more than the cost of the vaccine. So if I'm a drug company, I would take the position is don't give the MMR vaccine, and let's have the direct correlate diseases that come out of it so that I can make more money.
And the answer to your question is that when you vaccinate a child, the MMR and the full schedule of vaccines, what you have now is the rates of disease in this country, which is more than 50% of children who are suffering from chronic illness, 1 out of 6 children who are learning disabled, 1 out of 50 children who is autistic for life, where the treatment is $20,000 per month, and
none
on
of this
and on and on. So
but none of this
has been.
But it's more than that. Let's continue. At least, many of them, 50% of them will end up overweight, right? 10% of them will end up without shidduchim, right? 20% of them will unable to earn a living. Many of them will act out in class. Now, we could blame this all vaccine. I have a strong tendency towards carbohydrates. I blame that on vaccines too. All of this is malarkey. We do have direct evidence. If I'm the CEO of a drug company and somebody says, look, sir, we know that if we don't give vaccines directly, the MMR, you will have a 10x sale of drugs. And they have all this malarkey. It could cause weight gain. There's no proof to any of it. It's not a single credible report. I would say let's go with the obvious. Let's not give the vaccine, cause all this damage, sell all these drugs, and not believe some malarkey that the vaccine could cause that. None of that could be proven. I would go with the definite if I was a CEO, right?
Okay, so let me tell you what is definite. What is definite is that children who are fully vaccinated with the MMR and all the other vaccines will use, I'm going to say a conservative number, between 5 and 10 times the amount of medical health care dollars over their childhood than an unvaccinated child. Yes, there is. It's in many studies. No, it's not.
Tell me one study. Name one. Name one study.
Which drug?
Rabbi, name one. I challenge you. Name one scientific study from an accepted scientific platform.
That's the
one
key word.
Journal.
That's the key word.
Right. One journal.
Right.
That has said this. Not a government agency. Which medical journal? Name one.
Which medical journal supported by pharmaceutical will do something to make the drugs look bad?
This is Terutzim. Name one. The halacha is you go bust a boy right from. Name one journal, just one journal, one scientific body that backs up what you just said.
What's a scientific body?
What is what? You sound like Bill Gates who's getting.
Where do you get your information? Information?
So name one scientific body. We can ask, what does body mean? What does scientific mean? What does name mean?
What you need to say, which scientific body which has the approval of the drug companies can say something to the detriment of the drug companies. That's what
or not approval of the drug companies.
Or
which journal? Name one. Name hundreds. Name one. I just asked you to name one.
I don't have them on my fingertips. They're readily available on the internet. There have been hundreds of studies.
I offer you to call me. I offer you, we'll do another interview with you. Take as much time as you want. Name one credible journal, just one that backs up anything that you're saying. Because if it doesn't, I'll tell you what it is. If it doesn't, the Shulchan Aruch says you go basa roiv reifim.
What's a reif? An allopath?
Now we don't know what a reif is. No, a reif. What's a reif?
Yeah.
A reif is someone who has a medical degree.
Is a
somebody who has a
reif?
Somebody
has a degree. You're saying only if the government approves it? Only if there's an allopathic
So there is no, we don't know what body is, we don't know what science is, we don't know right. We're going to follow our instinct.
No, we will follow all sides, and we will get to the truth.
Well, Rabbi Gottesman, it's interesting to hear this opinion, and if you ever do find out who did the 9/11, now knowing it wasn't the Saudi Arabians, I'd love to hear about it. Thank you very much. Okay?
Gottesman. Absolutely.
We have on the phone with us from New York City, Joey Aaron. He's an attorney. His law firm is Aaron Law. He's also a Talmud of Chafetz Chaim. His expertise is employment law, constitutional law. Welcome, Joey.
Thank you, David.
So you've been involved in this case, or you've been with this. Well, why don't you, instead of me telling the story, why don't you tell the story?
Sure. So I have an employment law practice that centers around religious discrimination. And in general, I have an interest in constitutional law, constitutional issues. So around 2 weeks ago, a friend of mine called me up. He was in court, and he's an attorney as well, and he saw a parent bring a case against the yeshiva in an application for what's called a TRO to compel a yeshiva to take an unvaccinated child. So since I have an interest in religious-oriented constitutional issues, it was something I was interested in. It also happened to be in front of a judge that I clerked for a year. So I had an interest in the case, and I spent some time researching the law because it was an interesting topic. So before I get into the actual case, I'll give you a little bit of a backdrop. It starts, I guess, there was a 1905 case called Jacobson against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And this fellow, Mr. Jacobson, what happened was there was a smallpox outbreak. And the Commonwealth of Massachusetts made some type of law that everybody has to be vaccinated. So this Jacobson fellow, previously he had, adverse reactions to vaccinations. So he didn't want to be vaccinated. So what happened was he was actually charged. It was a criminal statute, and he was found guilty by a jury, and he was fined $5 for 1905 for not vaccinating. He then went up to the Supreme Court, and he challenged the rule that he had to be vaccinated under various liberties that are guaranteed by the Constitution, saying, you know, what right essentially does the government have to mandate that he's vaccinated, and that it infringes on his liberties as a citizen of this country. Essentially what the court found was that when there's public welfare at stake, you know, your liberties take a second seat, and they're subordinate to the public welfare, and he lost the case. So that's a little bit of a backdrop. So what happened here was a parent didn't want to vaccinate, and this is in New York, so they sued the yeshiva to compel their kid. Now, at the beginning of a litigation, nobody really spells out their case after one side files a summons and complaint. Under extraordinary circumstances, so a side could run to the court and bring what's called a TRO, a temporary restraining order, and that could be to prohibit something or to compel something, to ask the court to, you know, to make something happen immediately, because essentially it's a little bit more complex, but in simplistic terms, there'll be an immediate harm if the court doesn't intervene. So here the parent went to the court, and the parent said, I'd like my kid to have to go to, to be compelled to enter yeshiva, even though they weren't vaccinated. And the basis is that there's a seemingly exemption for children of religious families that have a sincerely held religious belief that they don't have to be vaccinated. So that's the backdrop of the case. The case is very interesting because New York has a very interesting statute in the public health law, which essentially says a yeshiva, or not a yeshiva for that matter, any school is only allowed to accept a child if they're vaccinated. That's what the statute says. Under the statute, there's 14 subparagraphs, and one of them, subparagraph 9, is a carve-out, and it says if the family of this child has sincerely held religious beliefs against vaccination, the yeshiva or the school, whatever, should be exempt from following Public Health Law 2164, which otherwise would mandate admission. Now, here's where things get very complicated, very fast, and very tricky. The case law in New York, just a little backdrop, not everyone who's listening obviously is an attorney, the American legal system works by precedent of a higher court. So in Brooklyn, Kings County, in Nassau, in Rockland, the higher court is called the Second Department, and that comes before the New York Court of Appeals. So there's a second, I don't have it in front of me, I think the name is Bowdoin. There's a Second Department case from 2001 where the issue in front of the appellate court was different. A school didn't accept somebody's exemption, and they didn't accept it because they said the student's not from, I don't remember, a recognized religion. So the appellate court overturned. They said to have a sincerely held belief, you don't have to be part of a particular religion, and therefore you have to admit him. What's fascinating and interesting about the case is the way I read, and I've consulted with other attorneys in the area, the public health law is schools can only take unvaccinated kids. Subparagraph 9 just negates the general rule. I don't see how it prevents yeshivas from making their own rule. We only accept vaccinated kids. Now, what I assume happened was, from the limited papers I've seen in the 2001 case, is that was an argument never raised. So the courts only have the papers they have in front of them, and they're done. They judge based on the papers they have in front of them. But at the end of the day, what we have is, from a 2001 Second Department case, is a court compelling admission of an unvaccinated kid. So I personally believe it's a misreading of the statute. So when this application was brought to the judge, that 2001 case was cited as precedent for the judge to compel admission. Now, 2 weeks ago, when it was in front of the judge, Judge Landesino in Kings County Supreme, he didn't compel admission. And one of the reasons was he really wanted to see a full story, because as you know, David, when someone goes for emergency application, you don't really have both sides briefed. Like a typical scenario would be somebody's building something on somebody's property. So they file a summons and complaint, and then they make an affidavit, a sworn statement, which is evidence. They run to court. They say, hey, he's building on my property. And the court will say, you know what, here's a sworn statement. We're going to, stop the building pending resolution on the merits. So this case, obviously, the judge saw as much more complex and said, come back. It's calendared for November 16th when the yeshiva could brief their side and state their legal basis to present what they believe their right was for not accepting the child. I wasn't
now,
there when it was...
Joey, so what actually happened? Did the parents cave, or they're out of school and they're waiting?
No, so what happened is now, like any case, you'll have a long-term litigation that will go on until who knows when.
So the kid is
home.
The
kid is not in school.
Now, could you explain how they could compel to take a kid where if this kid gets measles, he could put any other child in the school who has, an immune deficiency disorder, cancer, or anything else, he could put their lives at risk. Could you explain how a judge could possibly compel a school to take in basically like a maybe an atom bomb into their school? It boggles the imagination.
So that's an excellent question. First, let me just step back because I wasn't clear and answer your first question about the posture of the case. So I think the case is on again November 16th. They didn't get the emergency application. Then they'll apply when it's fully briefed on November 16th for what's called a preliminary injunction. If they don't get that, the case will just run its course, and a litigation could go on for 5-6 years. In terms of how the court could compel, could force a yeshiva or any other school for that matter to take a kid, it's really very simple. Everybody's basis here is saying that this subparagraph 9, the exception, functions as a standalone rule to respect and acknowledge religious exemptions. And I disagree with that as a matter of structure of how the statute's written. But let's suppose for a minute the legislature in Albany got together and they decided statutorily, just one line, there is a religious exemption and schools must. That's the statute. That's the law. The law doesn't have to make sense. A lot of times it doesn't make sense. Now,
wait, Joey. A religious exemption means I have the freedom to practice my religion. Let's say my religion is human sacrifice, where I could grab your child and roast them. Does the religious exemption mean I have a right to damage you?
So it obviously doesn't.
It's mind-boggling. So you could bring my religious exemption says I should put your life at risk?
It obviously doesn't, and I could prove it from two things.
But
one is I started...
And you know what I think borders on the absurd? Yeshivas, right, in a lot of these communities, Williamsburg, Lakewood, Muncie, and especially many of they won't take your child in if the parents go to the movies. They won't take a child in if they wear a blue shirt, if the mother doesn't dress. So that's considered a danger to the other kids, and the schools say we have a right to protect our children. So to protect the child from a blue shirt, you have a right to. But to protect the children in the school from maybe dying or contracting some disease from this from this kid who's coming in, it just boggles it's such an incredibly krum svara. It's beyond me,
So let me answer the question, not as a POSIC, an infectious disease doctor, or an ethicist, but from a legal perspective even, I think you're 100% right. And the first thing I said was this 1905 case from Jacobson. And it's very telling, meaning the whole idea of a religious exemption would presumably come from the free exercise clause of the Constitution. The court said in 1905, and we could get into it, it was reaffirmed in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in 2015, that if your belief infringes on the public welfare, if your liberty infringes on the public welfare, your liberty has no standing. We ignore it because the public welfare comes first. And the court said that in the context of everything we were promised by the Constitution. So you're right, I agree. I also happen to think that, and let me get into this because this you'll find interesting, this whole thing of a religious exemption itself, the court's been clear and it's spelled out. If you think MMR leads to autism, or if you think who knows what, that's not a sincerely religious belief. That's a medical belief. That's not covered by the statute. The statute covers a religious belief, and the courts have a tremendous amount of jurisprudence of parsing out what's a religious belief, what's a philosophical belief, what's a medical belief. But assuming somebody has, and again, I'm not here as a POSIC or a Rav, somebody has a legitimate religious belief, I'm not sure why the school couldn't invoke the same thing. Meaning, you have a school here that it's a chrai for other kids, and in the last 2 weeks, you've had through the wazoo articles of this POSIC, Rav Shlomo Zalman, Rav Eliashiv, this one, that one, who knows really who said what, but are quoted that, a school has a chiyuv to care for the welfare of their kids. So I think that religious argument is even stronger on behalf of the institution, which there's tremendous case law that the courts or the legislature can infringe on how religious institutions operate. I think that's a much stronger religious argument than an individual parent would have, assuming that they have a a bona fide religious argument or belief.
Okay. Well, Joey, you know what? You're going to be following this case. You're saying it's going to the preliminary hearing is on November 16th, and we'd be very fascinated to hear how the court rules.
Let me just say one thing that's interesting. So since I started speaking about it, and I wrote an article because I was interested, so I got multiple phone calls from different yeshivos who are struggling this week in Brooklyn with how to move forward because they've gotten calls from parents who don't want to send their kids with unvaccinated kids. And, for a school to do something now, to some extent, they're exposing themselves to some type of legal peril because who knows what's going to be and who knows, the case law is one way, I think it's the other way. But there is one thing that's concrete, and it's in the statute, is that the health commissioner has the authority to suspend religious exemptions, assuming that there are some, based on an outbreak or based on anything else. That's what happened in Rockland County, and that was subject to
Joey,
effect.
could you just clarify, what's religious about not getting vaccinated? I don't get it. Where does religion come into this?
Right, so this I said before. I'm not a rabbi. I'm clearly not here as a rabbi. I don't know. But
it's
apparently the forms that yeshivas are getting are that from people
we
who
disagree. We don't think it's religious. We think religion compels vaccination. So we disagree that it's a religious belief. We think it's a very unreligious belief that I don't think somebody wanted to suggest you're rodef. I don't think you're rodef, but you're certainly a mazik, right? You'd be chayiv arguably nezik tzari b'sheves abayshis, and you're either a boyer or aish or an adam a mazik. We could debate which one. You're certainly a mazik. It's a derais of mazik. So our religious belief compels you should get a vaccination. I don't
listen.
Religious belief is malarkey.
But religious belief in a legal context itself is hard to understand. What actually is a religious belief is really, in most of these cases, the only issue of fact for a jury to determine whether or not somebody has a sincerely held religious belief. So just because 99 out of 100 poskim would hold that you're mechuyev to give your kid an MMR, that's not dispositive of whether or not you have a religious belief.
What did you want to say in closing, Joey?
So I was going back to before. What I wanted to say is it's indisputable that the commissioner has authority to suspend exemptions, and I think that's what happened in Rockland County. So, ultimately, if the yeshivas want some cover from the phone calls I got this week, I said, call up the health commissioner and try to get some cover, see if they'll suspend the dispensation or purported dispensation for religious exemptions. So, it's hard to predict how any litigation obviously is going to go, but that's something that would clearly give yeshivas the cover they need from unnecessary exposure.
Well, we look forward to speaking soon, following up when you tell us what happened at the hearing.
Okay, thank you, David.
Okay, take care, Colton. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
In conclusion, if this was a stock and you had 99.999% of all the experts saying this is going up, and you had 3 discredited analysts who are called incompetent lawyers by courts in many different jurisdictions around the world, and you went ahead and you said, I'm not buying that stock, I'm shorting that stock, I would say, you know what, you're not a very good investor. And for somebody to put their child's health, possibly the child's life at risk by not vaccinating, a significant amount of these children who get sick with measles lose hearing for life, develop encephalitis, other diseases, permanent brain damage. You're going to do it based on the word of 3 debunked lawyers? Astonishing. I'm wishing you all the best. This is David Lichtenstein for Headlines Radio.